Imagine you walk into a crowded room and suddenly your eyes land on someone familiar. But did you really see them? Or did your mind just expect them to be there? Here's the unsettling truth. Your brain isn't a camera capturing reality. It's more like a film editor, cutting, arranging, and sometimes even fabricating scenes to match what you already believe. This phenomenon is called perceptual bias, and it shapes your life every single day. Consider a classic experiment. Two groups watched the same basketball game. One group was told a player was violent, the other heard he was passionate. Later, each group remembered completely different games, describing actions and motives that fit their expectations, even inventing moments that never happened. Your brain works like this constantly, editing your perception to fit your story. Take the cocktail party effect. You're surrounded by noise, but the instant someone says your name, it jumps out, sometimes even when it wasn't spoken at all. Or think of the famous dress. Was it blue and black or white and gold? The answer depended entirely on your mind's assumptions, not on the actual image. Your brain doesn't just filter out what doesn't fit. Sometimes it fills in blanks with convincing illusions. Belief can even override pain or fear, like when people given sugar pills experience real relief, just because they believe they should. Eyewitnesses to the same event often give wildly different but equally sincere reports, each filtered by their beliefs. This isn't deception, it's perception, rebuilt from fragments your mind selects and arranges. So next time you're absolutely sure of what you saw or heard, pause. Did you experience the real world or just the version your brain wanted you to see? The line between belief and reality is thinner than you think. Imagine waking up to a world that feels solid and real, yet every detail, the warmth in a stranger's smile, the threat in a shadowy alley, the stories you tell about your own past, is filtered, bent, and colored by what you already believe. This isn't just philosophy, it's science. Neuroscientists have found that beliefs act like a lens in your brain, sharpening some meanings and blurring others, based not on objective reality, but on what makes you feel safe, certain, or part of a tribe. If you expect danger, your amygdala fires up, making you see threat in harmless faces. If you're taught as a child that you're special, your brain highlights compliments and erases criticism, sculpting confidence from thin air. This is why two people at the same event recall wildly different stories, each narrative bent by private beliefs. The placebo effect proves belief's raw power. Patients given sugar pills, convinced they'll heal, actually feel less pain. Their brains produce real endorphins because faith overrides fact. Even your memory isn't safe. Psychologists have shown that if someone repeatedly tells you a story about your childhood, your brain can manufacture detailed memories that never happened, just to keep your beliefs consistent. Your mind edits reality for emotional comfort and inherited stories, hiding the process so well you think it's truth. So next time you feel certain, ask yourself, am I seeing the world or just a reflection of my faith? Imagine you wake up in a world where every doubt, every fear, every raw ache for meaning is immediately wrapped in a sacred phrase. Have faith. It is written. There's a reason for everything. These mantras become armor, soft at first, then slowly hardening until they're impossible to remove. But beneath these words, something stranger happens. Psychologists call it a thought loop, a self-reinforcing cycle, not of curiosity, but of closure. Each time the mantra is repeated, it becomes a little more real, a little less questioned. Why do our brains love this? Neuroscience shows that repeated thoughts form strong neural connections, creating well-worn mental pathways. The brain craves certainty, and certainty lives inside the loop. Consider the child who wonders, why do bad things happen? The answer comes not as an exploration, but as a wall. God works in mysterious ways. End of path. The mind's engine, built to wander and test and doubt, is idled by a closed circuit. This isn't unique to any one religion. Any ideology can become a loop. Political slogans, superstitions, even the stories we tell ourselves about who we are, each can trap the mind if left unquestioned. Science reveals that the more often a thought is repeated, the less the brain wants to resist it. Over time, the mantra becomes invisible, not wisdom, but habit. Breaking the loop feels terrifying. To question is to risk exile from your group, your past, even your sense of self. But real growth begins the moment you dare to interrupt the loop, to sit in silence and let uncertainty burn away false comfort. So next time you hear yourself reciting the same answer, pause. Is it truth or just a thought loop? When the loop breaks, your mind can finally see beyond its own boundaries. That is where wisdom truly begins. Imagine waking up certain that today everything will change. Abundance, happiness, freedom just waiting for you. But as night falls, you're right back in the same invisible prison. Its bars rebuilt from your own thoughts. You're not failing to manifest abundance because you lack belief. You're failing because your deepest beliefs are designed for survival, not for freedom. This isn't spiritual rhetoric. It's biology. For millennia, your brain evolved to keep you safe, vigilant, anxious, always alert to risk. Your subconscious scans for threats, clings to the familiar, repeats old patterns to avoid the unknown. Every time you try to dream bigger, those ancient neural circuits quietly steer you back toward what's safe. The result? You unconsciously sabotage the very opportunities you crave, missing the job, ending the relationship, walking away from the unknown. Neuroscientists call this predictive processing. Your mind doesn't just respond to reality, it constructs it, using old beliefs as blueprints. If you secretly expect rejection or loss, your brain edits reality until you find evidence of it, ignoring what doesn't fit the script. This is why affirmations rarely work if your core programming is wired for caution. You're trapped by a cage that feels invisible but is absolutely real, a product of evolutionary psychology and modern neuroscience. To truly manifest change, you must first confront the raw fear beneath your desires, dismantle the ancient survival algorithm, and dare to imagine a world beyond the bars. The cage was built to protect you, but only you can choose to walk out. What if your reality is a mirror, endlessly polished by your own expectations, reflecting back only what you already believe you'll see? Imagine entering a crowded room. If you expect rejection, every sideways glance becomes a silent judgment, every pause an invisible verdict. But if you expect acceptance, the world shifts. Smiles become signals, gestures become invitations, and warmth flickers in the background noise. This isn't just positive thinking, it's selective attention, a powerful, scientifically proven filter. Psychologists have shown that expectation can literally change perception. In the invisible gorilla experiment, most people missed the absurd figure because their minds were trapped by what they expected to see. In life, this happens constantly. A student convinced they're not smart notices every failure, ignoring small successes. Someone certain they're unloved sees only coldness, missing every sign of care. Your beliefs act like rivers, carving grooves into your mind, shaping what you see and remember. Science calls this confirmation bias, the tendency to seek and remember information that supports what you already believe. It's why expectations become self-fulfilling prophecies. Your beliefs don't just color reality, they construct it. Every moment is filtered and edited by your mind to fit the story it expects. In the end, you live in the echo of your own expectations. Imagine you're standing in pitch blackness, holding a flashlight. It doesn't show you the full room, just a small circle of light. But you cling to it, not because it reveals the truth, but because the dark feels unbearable. That flashlight is certainty. Your mind craves it not because it's right, but because uncertainty feels like death to your subconscious. The more scared your inner world, the more rigid your beliefs become, because certainty feels like survival. This isn't just philosophy, it's raw neuroscience. The amygdala, your brain's ancient fear center, responds not only to threats of physical harm, but also to social shame, ideological collapse, and identity loss. When you're flooded with doubt, It hijacks your logic and demands a stable answer. Any answer. Certainty becomes your shield, even if it's made of lies. That's why people cling to extreme beliefs after trauma. Why in times of crisis conspiracy theories bloom like wildfire. Certainty isn't clarity, it's control. In studies, participants shown fear-inducing images gravitated toward black and white moral judgments. Their brain wasn't seeking truth, it was screaming for safety. The mind, when panicked, doesn't solve, it seals. Think of history, inquisitions, purges, silenced voices. Not born from confidence, but from the terror of not knowing. Certainty becomes a prison you decorate with meaning. Real strength? It's not in having answers. It's in the quiet bravery to sit with questions. To say, I don't know, and still breathe. Because maybe the light we seek isn't in clinging to the flashlight, but in daring to let it go. Imagine a child lost in a dark forest. Instead of searching for a way out, they build a small fire and convince themselves the world ends at the edge of its glow. That's what belief becomes, not a pursuit of truth, but a strategy for managing fear. The human brain doesn't crave truth. It craves patterns, safety, and certainty feels like safety, even when it's an illusion. Most belief systems aren't ladders, they're walls. Neuroimaging shows that during deep ideological or religious conviction, the brain lights up areas linked to emotional safety, not logic. It rewards belief. This is why people double down when challenged. They're not defending truth, they're defending themselves. Even falsehoods, repeated with confidence, become anchors. Over time, comfort replaces curiosity. Exploration is traded for repetition, and soon, the known becomes sacred, not because it's true, but because it's familiar. We build temples around ideas we stopped questioning long ago, and in doing so, we confuse memorized stories with actual understanding. But real wisdom doesn't come from what we've memorized. It comes from what we're willing to unlearn. It's in standing at the edge of the firelight, eyes open, letting go of the need to be right, and daring to face the dark without flinching. Truth doesn't live in the warmth, it waits in the cold, just beyond certainty. Imagine being in a room full of strangers. One person stands up, speaks with absolute certainty, and suddenly, everyone listens. Why? Not because they're right, but because confidence mimics truth. Your brain craves clarity, and in moments of doubt, it shortcuts toward authority. This is the authority bias, an evolutionary trait that once kept us safe in tribes, but now leaves us vulnerable to illusion and manipulation. In 1961, psychologist Stanley Milgram ran an infamous experiment. Volunteers were told to administer electric shocks to another person when instructed by a man in a lab coat. Most complied, even when they believed they were causing serious harm. Why? The authority figure looked official, sounded confident, and removed moral hesitation. They weren't monsters. They were human minds overwhelmed by structure. It's the same reason soldiers obey brutal orders, why cults grow, and why charismatic leaders can warp entire realities. We don't just follow logic, we follow presence. Your brain prefers someone who seems certain over someone who admits complexity. That's why misinformation thrives when delivered with unwavering conviction. Not because it's correct, but because it's easy to follow and comforting in chaos. In politics, media, classrooms, even families, the voice that sounds above becomes the voice you trust. And over time, you forget to question. You inherit beliefs, not through evidence, but through tone, posture, and repetition. This isn't stupidity. It's a deep survival instinct misapplied in a modern, manipulated world. So the next time someone speaks with unshakable certainty, ask yourself, do they hold truth or just your unexamined trust? Imagine your mind standing at a fork in the road. One path is paved with facts, cold and precise. The other winds through the warmth of a story. Without hesitation, your brain drifts toward the story. Not because it's true, but because it feels like it should be. This isn't just poetic. It's how cognition works. Neuroscience shows that when we hear facts, only our language centers activate. But when we hear stories, multiple brain regions light up. Emotions, memory, motor responses. It becomes personal. That's why false beliefs wrapped in compelling narratives survive for generations, while raw truths fade into footnotes. Consider how urban myths spread faster than medical advice. Why? Because myths come with characters, conflict, emotion. Facts don't. It's not logic that wins, it's narrative gravity. Politicians, cult leaders, marketers, they all know this. They don't sell truth. They sell coherence, repetition, and meaning. Think about flat earth theories, anti-vaccine propaganda, or pseudoscientific diets. These thrive not because of data, but because they're told like sagas with villains, secrets, and redemption arcs. You remember the story of Icarus, not the physics of flight. You recall childhood fables, not scientific journals. Religion, ideology, even identity, their stories first, doctrines second. In a world drowning in data, it's the story that cuts through. The brain craves what resonates, not what verifies. So we pass down stories. We repeat what fits, not because it's right, but because it sticks. We're not wired for truth. We're wired for the tale that feels like one. And in that feeling, reality often gets rewritten. Imagine believing something not because it healed you, but because it hurt you so deeply. It had to mean something. Across cultures and centuries, the most sacred beliefs are often forged in fire. Why? Because the human brain cannot tolerate meaningless suffering. It rewrites pain into purpose. It turns trauma into theology. It transforms agony into holy narrative. In neuroscience, this is known as the meaning-making reflex. When the mind is pushed to its limits, when agony becomes unbearable, the brain doesn't shut down. It adapts. It spins suffering into structure, into story. Not necessarily a true one, but one that justifies endurance. That's why victims of abuse sometimes become defenders of the very system that broke them. They've fused their identity with the pain. If the pain was pointless, then so was the survival. Religious self-flagellation, brutal rites of passage, silence in dark monasteries, isolation in desert caves. Pain is framed as sacred purification. But is that reverence or rationalization? The more you suffer under a belief, the more divine it feels. Because letting go doesn't just mean changing your mind, it means admitting your suffering might not have led anywhere at all. And this isn't limited to religion. It echoes in military hazing, toxic families, manipulative relationships. The more it hurt, the more it must be defended. Pain demands purpose, or it devours you. Pain becomes scripture when belief becomes the only way to survive the memory. But some pain isn't redemptive. Some doesn't transform. It just haunts. And the real freedom comes not from enduring it, but from no longer needing it to mean something. Imagine a child punished harshly for speaking up. Years later, that same child grows into an adult who enforces silence in others. Not out of cruelty, but because they were taught that pain equals order. This is the rule repeater, the one who inherits a system of control, internalizes its suffering, and then passes it down like a sacred script. Psychologically, it's a cycle of trauma disguised as tradition. Studies in behavioral conditioning show that repeated punishment without autonomy leads to learned helplessness, a state where the mind stops resisting and starts conforming. But here's the twist. Once conditioned, we don't just obey the system. We defend it, even replicate it. Why? Because if we suffered under rules we couldn't escape, then repeating them gives that suffering meaning. If I endured it, so should you. In schools, in families, in workplaces, you see it. People enforcing rules they once hated. Not because the rules are just, but because breaking them would make their past pain feel pointless. The brain does this to maintain coherence. A contradiction, I was hurt for no reason, is too painful to sit with. So, we rewrite the narrative. It must have been good for me. That's why I'm teaching it now. And so, the abused becomes the enforcer. The victim becomes the guardian of the cage. This is why outdated norms survive, why people shame others for stepping outside lines that once trapped them. It's not strength, it's unresolved pain echoing forward. Freedom begins the moment you question the rules you once obeyed. Not all structure is oppression, but not all rules are sacred either. Some are wounds pretending to be wisdom. Imagine locking your door every night, not because it stops danger, but because it helps you sleep. That's how belief often works. It doesn't explain reality, it simulates safety. The brain craves stability more than truth. And in a chaotic world, belief becomes emotional armor. We accept stories that push the unknown just far enough away to keep functioning. Like a child clutching a nightlight, we cling to rituals that soothe, not enlighten. Neuroscience reveals our brains prioritize emotional regulation over accuracy. We don't adopt beliefs because they're proven. We adopt them because they protect us from the unbearable weight of uncertainty. The unknown is too big, too dark, too endless. So we build mental stage sets, security theater, where belief becomes the spotlight. But just because the light is on doesn't mean the monster isn't still out there. Truth doesn't come from feeling safe. It comes from stepping into the dark without flinching, eyes open, no script, no guarantees. Only then do we begin understanding. The comfort of belief is addictive. It activates dopamine, rewards certainty, and silences ambiguity. Myths persist even when data disproves them. People defend false ideas fiercely. It's not stupidity, it's survival. Comfort isn't clarity. Growth begins in darkness, not in pretending your flashlight is the sun. Imagine if your memories weren't records, but rewrites. Every time you recall an event, your brain edits it, just slightly, then stores the new version, not the original. But here's the twist. It edits not for truth, but for meaning, for emotional alignment, for narrative coherence. You don't remember what happened. You remember what made sense to you at the time. This is memory reconsolidation. Every act of remembering is an act of rewriting. Your brain pulls the file, alters it unconsciously to match your current beliefs and feelings, then saves it again, edited. Over time, your past becomes a curated fiction. But it feels real. It feels sacred. And that illusion is dangerous. In 1974, psychologists Loftus and Palmer showed participants a video of a car crash. When asked how fast the cars were going, those who heard the word smashed recalled higher speeds and even broken glass, glass that never existed. One single word, and the memory warped. That's how fragile memory is. Now imagine this happening over decades. Your identity, what you think you've lived, is often a carefully pruned narrative shaped by survival, shame, and pride. If admitting fault breaks the story, your brain may erase the detail. If victimhood brings clarity, the memory may rearrange itself accordingly. And this isn't unique to trauma. It happens daily. You argue with someone, and a week later, you genuinely recall yourself saying things you never said, feeling things you never felt. You think you're recalling history, but often you're recalling propaganda, emotional propaganda, written by a mind desperate to stay intact. So the next time you cling to a memory, ask yourself, is this what happened, or what I needed to believe happened? Imagine feeling guilt for something harmless, an urge, a thought, a question. Not because it hurt anyone, but because someone once told you it was wrong. This isn't morality, it's programming. Morality shaped by fear doesn't teach compassion, it enforces obedience. And over time, the voice that once came from outside becomes your own inner critic. Many so-called morals aren't based on reason or ethics. They're designed to regulate behavior through shame. Psychology calls this introjected regulation, when you adopt rules without reflection, driven not by values, but by fear of rejection. The result? You follow commandments you never chose, defend standards you never examined, and feel guilt that isn't even yours. Think of how cultures shame sexuality, curiosity, or doubt. Not because they're evil, but because they threaten control. A child raised in such systems learns to fear their own mind. They call it conscience, But it's just a trained reflex, guilt triggered by disobedience, not by injustice. And what's worse, most never notice the difference. Religions, ideologies, even school systems often install these invisible leashes. You stop asking, "Is this right?" and start asking, "Will I be punished?" That isn't morality, that's compliance. And compliance, when unquestioned, becomes self-censorship, policing your own thoughts to stay safe. Real ethics begins where indoctrination ends, when you question the source of your guilt, when you ask who benefits from your shame, when you stop fearing your own freedom. Because sometimes, the voice that says, "You're wrong," is just an echo of a chain someone else wrapped around your mind. And silence, in that moment, becomes rebellion. Imagine living in a room with invisible walls. You can't see them, can't touch them, but every time you try to leave, something stops you. Not a force, a silence, a shared unspoken agreement that this is where you belong. That's how invisible belief systems work. They aren't written in stone or shouted in sermons. They're what people don't question, because questioning them feels like betrayal, even if no one says it out loud. In psychology, these are known as implicit cultural norms, shared assumptions embedded so deeply they vanish into the background of consciousness. Like the air you breathe, they shape every choice, every habit, every value, without ever announcing themselves. Children absorb them without realizing. Adults defend them without knowing why. They aren't enforced by laws, but by invisible pressure. Try breaking one, and watch the discomfort ripple through the room, unspoken but palpable. Consider gender roles, family structures, nationalism, productivity. Who told you what success looks like? Who defined what is respectable, what is shameful? These beliefs weren't selected, they were absorbed, passed down through rituals, glances, offhand comments, and the silence that follows anything too different. And because no one questions them, no one escapes them. The most dangerous prison is the one without bars, because you don't even realize you're confined. You just call it normal. But normal isn't neutral. It's engineered by the invisible rules you never chose to follow. What if the truth isn't buried under lies, but drowned in silence? What if the strongest beliefs are the ones you never realized were there at all? Imagine telling someone the exact facts that prove their belief wrong. You show them data, evidence, logic, undeniable truth. And yet, instead of changing their mind, they dig in deeper. They double down. They defend harder. Why? Because beliefs don't just protect ideas, they protect identity. This is called the backfire effect, a psychological phenomenon where confronting someone with contradictory evidence only strengthens their original belief. It's not about logic, it's about survival. In the brain, beliefs are processed in the same regions that handle self-perception and emotional threat. So when a belief is attacked, it feels like you're being attacked. Neuroscience shows that the anterior insula and amygdala, regions linked to pain and fear, light up when people hear arguments that challenge deeply held views. The reaction isn't intellectual, it's primal, it's self-defense. The brain treats opposing facts like incoming danger, and the more central that belief is to someone's identity, political, religious, cultural, the stronger the effect. It doesn't matter how rational the argument is. If accepting the truth means losing your tribe, your story, your sense of self, the mind will reject it like a virus. This is why debates rarely change minds, why shouting louder doesn't work. Because what's under threat isn't the idea, it's the person. Real change begins with safety, not confrontation. You don't melt armor with fire, you melt it with warmth. Until someone feels safe enough to question their belief without losing themselves, no amount of proof will ever be enough. So next time you see someone locked in a false belief, don't just challenge the idea, reach the identity behind it. That's where the truth gets in. Imagine questioning a belief. It feels chaotic. Your brain doesn't distinguish between physical danger and a challenge to identity. It fires survival signals. Your pulse quickens. Thoughts race. You're not under attack from the outside, you're under attack from within. Neuroscience shows that doubt activates the brain's threat circuits. The ego responds like it's being hunted. This is why people cling to beliefs. Not because they're true, but because letting go feels fatal. A broken belief exposes ego to a vast, uncertain world, and the ego panics. We defend the illusion to survive, not to be right. That's why logic rarely changes minds. You're not debating facts, you're threatening safety. You hit identity, and identity fights back. Doubt becomes a toxin, a virus, a crack in the dam. So we push it away, bury it, or attack the source. But what if doubt isn't danger? What if it's the beginning of clarity? Every breakthrough, every awakening starts with discomfort. Ego doesn't die from doubt. It grows through it. Disbelief isn't a storm to fear, it's a doorway. But most never walk through. They build walls and stay inside, safe, numb, rehearsing the same old truths. Growth begins there, in storms, not silence. Doubt hurts because it matters. It stings because something false is falling away. And maybe, just maybe, what survives that fall is who you really are. Imagine holding on to a belief, not because it helps you, but because letting go would hurt more. This is the paradox of loyalty to illusions. We don't just resist truth, we resist the pain of realizing we were fooled. And often, that pain feels worse than the illusion itself. Psychologists call this cognitive dissonance. When your actions or beliefs collide with new evidence, your mind doesn't always choose truth, it chooses relief. It's less painful to justify a lie than admit you've been living one. This is why people stay in toxic relationships, defend harmful ideologies, or double down on failed decisions. The lie becomes part of their identity, and identity is sacred. A classic study showed that when cult predictions failed, when the prophesied apocalypse never came, the members didn't disband. They believed even harder. Why? Because admitting the truth meant admitting their devotion was wasted. Their sacrifices meant nothing, and that pain was too much to bear. We're not wired for truth, we're wired for coherence. The illusion, if believed long enough, becomes comfort. Leaving it feels like betrayal, not just of the belief, but of the self who once believed it. That's why people fight to preserve false memories, faulty worldviews, and even abusive systems. The cost of waking up feels heavier than the cost of sleep. But illusions don't care about your comfort. They drain you quietly. Staying loyal doesn't mean you're wise. Sometimes it means you're scared. And courage isn't clinging. It's the choice to let go, even when it shatters your story. So ask yourself, what belief are you still protecting? Not because it's true, but because admitting it's false would break your heart. Imagine waking up and realizing that a part of you, something you've defended, argued for, built a life around, was never true. Not just wrong, but empty. That's not just a change of belief, it's ego death, because we don't just believe things, we become them. And when belief becomes identity, questioning it feels like tearing out your own spine. Psychologists call this identity fusion. Your opinions don't just belong to you, they are you. And so, any challenge to your worldview isn't felt as debate. It's felt as an attack on your very existence. That's why political conversations turn into wars. Why facts don't change minds. Why leaving a religion feels like grieving a loved one. The pain is real, because the self you thought you were begins to collapse under the weight of dissonance. And the mind resists that collapse with everything it has. It twists logic, distorts memory, and clings to falsehoods just to avoid the unbearable emptiness of not knowing who you are anymore. Belief, then, becomes a drug, not because it enlightens, but because it stabilizes. It gives coherence. It tells you what kind of person you are, even if it's a lie. Think about it. If your life was built on being the good one, the loyal one, the believer, what happens when that role no longer fits? Do you evolve? Or do you double down? Most choose comfort over chaos, but growth demands the opposite. It demands psychological death before rebirth. True freedom begins the moment you realize you are not your thoughts, not your history, not your belief system. You are the space in which they happen. And that space, it doesn't die when a belief does. It expands and waits, ready to be rewritten. Imagine waking up in a house you never chose, on a road you didn't build, chasing goals you never agreed to. That's what it means to carry beliefs installed before you had the ability to choose. They didn't ask for your permission. They arrived quietly, through childhood, through repetition, through tone of voice, through what was punished, through what was praised, through silence that followed your curiosity. This isn't just metaphor, it's neurological. During early development, your brain enters a hyperplastic state. It absorbs everything, especially the emotional resonance of experiences. If love was given when you obeyed and withdrawn when you questioned, then obedience becomes survival. Not just behavioral, but biological. Synapses wire, reflexes form. Identity gets shaped before awareness even awakens. And these unchosen beliefs, they don't just fade. They operate silently, like code in the background of a machine, dictating reality without ever revealing their presence. Who you think you are, what you believe is acceptable, whether you feel capable of change. It's not logic, it's programming. Most people never notice. They live their lives inside this invisible system, obeying a voice in their head that isn't really theirs, just an echo, a memory of conditioning. You didn't choose to feel broken. You didn't choose fear. Someone gave it to you, and you kept it. The scariest part isn't just that you've been programmed, it's that the program convinced you it was truth, that it was you. And until you trace it, question it, and rewrite it, you'll keep calling the voice in your head your own, never realizing it was installed without your consent. Imagine waking up in a house you never built, with walls you didn't choose, and rules written long before you were born. That house is your belief system. Most of what you believe about life, success, morality, identity, even love, was handed to you before you could even speak. Family, school, religion, media, they planted the architecture of your mind. You didn't build this cage, you inherited it. And the cage doesn't feel like a cage because it's all you've ever known. That's what makes it so dangerous. You think you're choosing your life, but really, you're just repeating someone else's programming. You chase goals they told you mattered. You fear what they feared. You judge yourself by rules they never questioned. You may call it tradition, but often it's just unexamined trauma dressed in ceremony. Psychologists call this introjected beliefs, values absorbed so deeply they feel like your own. But they aren't. They were uploaded into your brain before your critical thinking even existed. And unless you deliberately interrogate them, they run your life like invisible code. They shape your relationships, your career, your self-worth, without ever asking for permission. This isn't rebellion, it's reprogramming. To question your beliefs is not betrayal. It's the beginning of authorship. It's the first act of psychological adulthood. It's you deciding what's worth keeping and what needs to be torn down and rebuilt in your own voice. And yes, it's terrifying. Because leaving the inherited cage means admitting you were never truly free. But it's also liberation, because only in that moment do you begin to exist on your own terms. So pause, trace a belief, ask, did I choose this? Or was it chosen for me? That's not disrespect. That's awakening. That's the first crack in the cage and the first breath outside it. Imagine walking into a temple, not to pray, but to ask forbidden questions. That's where real spiritual clarity begins, not with belief, but with doubt. Doubt is sacred. It's the voice in a room of echoes. Belief offers comfort. Doubt demands truth. Neuroscience shows belief activates the brain's reward system. Belief feels good. Truth often doesn't. That's why doubt is painful. It tears away illusion. It strips reality bare. A believer sees what they expect. A doubter sees what actually is. Most spiritual systems reward faith, but growth begins when faith cracks and real questions emerge. Doubt humbles the ego. It dissolves certainty. It makes space for the unknown to speak. Philosophers, mystics, scientists all began in doubt, not to destroy meaning, but to reach deeper meaning. When you drop your story, the world shows its own. Doubt isn't absence of spirit, it's the courage to meet it naked. The mind screams for answers. The soul whispers through silence. And doubt teaches us how to hear. It isn't weakness, it's a doorway, a kind of fire that burns through fantasy, leaving behind only what's real. In a world obsessed with answers, doubt is rebellion, but it's also grace, the start of every honest search, the end of blind certainty. Doubt begins true sight. Imagine believing something so deeply, not because it uplifted you, but because it made you feel small. That's the hidden engine behind many belief systems. Guilt. Not joy, not clarity, guilt. It acts like glue. The more you hurt, the more you stay. And the more you stay, the more you confuse pain with proof of devotion. Your suffering becomes your sacrifice, and sacrifice feels holy. This isn't random. Guilt hijacks the brain's reward system. When you feel shame and then get relief through confession, prayer, sacrifice, or submission, your brain gives you a chemical reward. It reinforces the loop. Just like a gambler chasing redemption, you return to guilt not to suffer, but to feel pure again. The same system that wounds you offers the bandage. And so, the cycle thrives. Religious traditions have long understood this. Fasting, flagellation, vows of silence, acts not meant to solve, but to sanctify suffering. Pain becomes performance. The more it hurts, the more real it feels. If belief makes you bleed, then surely it must be sacred. And slowly, you begin to fear ease, mistrust peace, reject questions. You wear pain like proof. Even beyond religion, the ritual continues. People stay in families that belittle them, jobs that grind them down, ideologies that punish growth, not because they're thriving, but because leaving feels like betrayal. The deeper the guilt, the tighter the chain. Guilt becomes the gatekeeper. Freedom becomes the sin. But guilt doesn't equal growth. And a belief system that demands your suffering isn't asking for your faith. It's feeding on your fear. It's a parasite dressed as a purpose. So ask yourself, are you still loyal because it's right, or because the shame of being wrong keeps you from letting go? Imagine a world where belief is a currency, not something internal, but something you spend to belong. You don't believe to discover truth. You believe to survive. In school, in politics, even in friendships, belief isn't just opinion, it's social armor. And if yours doesn't match the crowd, you become a ghost. Unseen, unheard, unwanted. This isn't abstract, it's psychological reality. Humans evolved in tribes where belonging meant survival. Being cast out wasn't inconvenient, it was deadly. So the brain developed a mechanism, mirror belief. If the group says this is right, we echo it, often without noticing. Neuroscience shows rejection triggers the same brain regions as physical pain. That's why we conform. Not because we agree, but because we fear erasure from connection. In many systems, belief is performative. The more loudly you repeat the approved narrative, the more your status grows. Online, it's likes and retweets. In institutions, it's promotions and praise. But challenge the dogma, even gently, and you risk exile. People look through you, not with hatred, but with indifference. Silence becomes your punishment. This is why dissent feels like social suicide. You lose access to approval, to connection, to visibility. So most people learn to fake it. They nod, they signal, they conform not out of conviction, but out of fear of becoming irrelevant. But here's the question. If your beliefs are chosen to avoid rejection, do they truly belong to you? Or are you renting them from the dominant script just to stay visible? Real belief costs. It isolates. It demands courage, not just the illusion of strength, but only what you're willing to lose for can ever be truly yours. Imagine deleting every belief you hold about who you are, what life means, what's good or bad. What's left? Is there still a you? Or are you just a story that's been told so many times you forgot it was fiction? Most people live inside a script, an inherited, rehearsed narrative of identity. I'm this, I'm not that, I like this, I hate that. But where did these lines come from? From parents, teachers, culture, trauma, praise, rejection. Every sentence was written by a hand you didn't control. And slowly, word by word, those sentences hardened into a shape you started calling me. But belief is not identity. It's just scaffolding, a framework, a costume worn for so long it starts to feel like skin. We confuse the script with the soul. In neuroscience, the self isn't fixed. It's constructed moment by moment using memory, prediction, emotional signals. It's a process, not a permanent thing. That means the person you think you are can shift, radically, when the underlying script changes. But change is terrifying. The ego resists uncertainty like it resists death. Better a bad story than no story at all. Who are you without your beliefs? Without the story? Without the old phrases echoing in your head? Are you empty or finally alive? That terrifying blankness you fear, it might not be a void. It might be a garden, a soft, unclaimed space where truth can take root, where you can grow something that wasn't planted by someone else, something real. Maybe the self isn't found, it's built. And maybe freedom begins where the script ends, and the silence finally begins to speak in your own voice. Imagine standing in the freezing wind, shivering, when someone offers you a warm blanket. You know it's fake, just an illusion, but you wrap yourself in it anyway. Why? Because in that moment, comfort matters more than truth. That's what your brain does every day. It picks emotional warmth over factual coldness, and then calls it wisdom. This isn't weakness, it's survival. The human mind evolved to prioritize emotional stability over objective accuracy. When truth threatens your self-image, your relationships, or your sense of safety, the brain steps in and edits reality. It's called motivated reasoning. You aren't thinking to find the truth, you're thinking to protect your equilibrium. Studies in cognitive psychology show that people will rationalize false beliefs if the alternative causes too much inner conflict. It's not lying, it's self-preservation. Your mind whispers stories that keep the emotional thermostat from crashing. That's why some stay in toxic relationships, defend harmful ideologies, or deny painful realities. Truth is cold, comfort is warm. The prefrontal cortex may seek logic, but the limbic system, the emotional brain, still runs the show. It says, if the truth hurts, soften it, or ignore it completely. And it's efficient. Comfort reduces stress, stabilizes identity, and maintains social bonds. But at a cost, the more you choose warmth over accuracy, the further you drift from reality. True wisdom isn't choosing between comfort or truth. It's learning to face the cold with courage until it stops feeling like winter, because only then can you live in reality, not just survive it. So ask yourself, is this belief true, or just warm enough to keep you from breaking? Imagine discovering that the foundation of your house isn't stone, but sand painted to look like it. That's what happens when sacred beliefs are built on fiction. They feel solid, they feel true, but they were never grounded in fact, only in emotional resonance. The human brain isn't wired for truth, it's wired for survival. And the stories that survive aren't the accurate ones, they're the ones that feel right. Neuroscience shows that when a story aligns with emotion, the brain treats it as real, even if it's false. That's why myths endure. That's why false memories feel vivid. The emotional weight of a story makes it resistant to correction. We wrap identity around these narratives. We defend them, even as facts unravel. Some of your most sacred beliefs about your country, your childhood, your purpose may be stitched from echoes, exaggerations, and cultural fiction. But the brain doesn't care. If it feels true, it functions as truth. Over time, fiction hardens into foundation. We build identities on it. Religions, nations, families. The danger isn't belief in fiction. It's the refusal to question it. Truth doesn't fear inspection. Only lies need protection. If a belief can't survive doubt, It was never truth. It was comfort in disguise. Fiction soothes us. Truth rebuilds us. And the self born of truth is stronger and unafraid. Doubt is the tool that tests foundations. Imagine standing on a glass bridge, solid beneath your feet, until the first crack. That's what false certainty feels like. It offers strength, but only when unchallenged. It pretends to be steel, but the moment pressure builds, questions arise, doubts appear, it shatters. And when it does, it demands silence, not because it's strong, but because it's weak and terrified of collapse. Certainty gives us comfort. It tells the brain, you're safe, you know the rules. But that safety is often a lie. Real life is messy, complex, full of contradictions and nuance. Certainty tries to flatten it, reduce it to clean answers. And the cost? Curiosity, growth, dialogue. It builds a prison made of clarity and convinces you it's protection. Psychologically, this is called need for closure, the craving for firm answers and mental closure. We seek certainty like a drug. It calms the chaos. But in doing so, it becomes rigid, brittle, and sometimes cruel. Question a fragile belief and watch how quickly its defenders turn angry. Not because you're wrong, but because you've threatened their illusion of emotional safety. History is full of examples. Dogmatic regimes, cults, totalitarian ideologies all share this in common. They cannot tolerate doubt. They label questions as rebellion and curiosity as sin. But real strength isn't afraid of inquiry. Real strength bends without breaking. It listens. It evolves. The truth doesn't fear being examined. Lies do. So when your beliefs feel fragile under questioning, don't double down. Listen closer. Maybe that crack isn't failure. Maybe it's a doorway. Ask yourself, do you want a belief that can't be questioned or a truth that survives the test? Imagine standing in a burning room clutching a book that says someone will come to save you. Soon. You wait. The flames rise, and still you wait, because the story said they'd arrive. This is the illusion of the savior. Some systems aren't designed to rescue you. They're designed to keep you waiting. Not out of cruelty, but because waiting keeps you obedient, compliant, afraid to move. Religions, ideologies, even consumer cultures thrive on this. They offer salvation, a moment when all will be well. But that moment is always just out of reach. You're told to endure, to believe, to sacrifice, because relief is coming. But it never really arrives, not completely, because if it did, the system would lose its grip on your need and your loyalty. Psychologically, this taps into what's known as intermittent reinforcement, the same principle used in gambling. You get just enough hope, just enough reward to keep believing. You stay hooked, and belief itself becomes currency. You pay for the promise of salvation with your time, your energy, your identity. And the more you've invested, the harder it becomes to walk away. That's the trap. Think of prosperity gospel preachers who sell wealth in exchange for faith. Think of political movements that promise change but deliver slogans. Think of brands that market purpose but sell you emptiness. The Savior is always coming. Just keep buying. Just keep waiting. Just keep kneeling in quiet desperation. Real rescue isn't sold to you. It's built by you. Salvation isn't out there in someone else's hands. It's in the decision to stop waiting and start walking. The moment you stop believing someone else will fix it is the moment you begin. Imagine looking at a painting you've seen 1,000 times. You've named it, judged it, filed it away. But then one day, someone tilts the frame just slightly, and suddenly the colors shift. The shadows move. A hidden detail comes alive. The painting didn't change. You did. That's what a belief shift does to reality. It reframes the world without altering a single fact. Yet everything feels different. Your brain isn't showing you the world as it is. It's showing you the world filtered through what you expect, what you fear, and what you've learned to ignore. Neuroscience calls this predictive coding. Your brain constantly guesses what it thinks is out there, then molds your perception to fit the expectation. That means your reality is constantly edited, often without your awareness. The result isn't objective truth, it's a mental simulation shaped by belief, emotion, and memory. Reframe pain as growth, and it becomes a lesson. Reframe failure as redirection, and it becomes a doorway. The event itself didn't change, your relationship to it did. And when that internal lens shifts, your emotional landscape reshapes, your brain rewires, new neural pathways form, thoughts shift, actions change. The world outside begins to echo the transformation happening within. But here's the paradox. The more convinced you are that your current frame is objective reality, the more trapped you become. Certainty freezes perception. Curiosity loosens it. Flexibility rewrites the script. What if you tilted the frame again just slightly? What else might reveal itself? Maybe the world isn't changing. Maybe you are. And maybe that's the only change that ever truly transforms everything. Imagine looking at a painting you've seen 1,000 times. You've named it, judged it, filed it away. But then one day, someone tilts the frame just slightly, and suddenly the colors shift, the shadows move, a hidden detail comes alive. The painting didn't change. You did. That's what a belief shift does to reality. It reframes the world without altering a single fact, yet everything feels different. Your brain isn't showing you the world as it is. It's showing you the world filtered through what you expect, what you fear, and what you've learned to ignore. Neuroscience calls this predictive coding. Your brain constantly guesses what it thinks is out there, then molds your perception to fit the expectation. That means your reality is constantly edited, often without your awareness. The result isn't objective truth, it's a mental simulation shaped by belief, emotion, and memory. Reframe pain as growth, and it becomes a lesson. Reframe failure as redirection, and it becomes a doorway. The event itself didn't change, your relationship to it did, and when that internal lens shifts, your emotional landscape reshapes, your brain rewires, new neural pathways form, thoughts shift, actions change. The world outside begins to echo the transformation happening within. But here's the paradox. The more convinced you are that your current frame is objective reality, the more trapped you become. Certainty freezes perception. Curiosity loosens it. Flexibility rewrites the script. What if you tilted the frame again, just slightly? What else might reveal itself? Maybe the world isn't changing. Maybe you are. And maybe that's the only change that ever truly transforms everything. Imagine building a statue that only nods when you speak to it, then calling it divine. That's what happens when belief becomes a feedback loop. You stop searching for truth and start searching for validation. The mind doesn't want reality, it wants reassurance. And so we build gods, systems, and stories that reflect what we already believe. We don't worship the unknown, we worship our own certainty, projected outward. Neuroscience calls this confirmation bias. We seek, notice, and remember only what affirms what we already think. Over time, the belief doesn't evolve, it echoes. You're not hearing the universe, you're hearing yourself louder and louder. This is the feedback loop God, a belief system designed to confirm itself endlessly. Every coincidence becomes proof, every silence is interpreted as meaning, and every challenge is either ignored or turned into a test of faith. At some point, you're not practicing spirituality, you're protecting a mirror, and that mirror smiles every time you look at it. But real divinity doesn't flatter you. It confronts you. It expands you beyond what you already know. If your God always agrees with you, you haven't found truth, you've found a loop. Spiritual maturity begins when you can sit with silence that doesn't affirm you, when you can ask questions your God doesn't answer, when you break the mirror and still choose to look beyond it. You don't need a God who repeats you. You need something bigger, something that unsettles, challenges, and defies your expectations. Imagine someone telling you your suffering had a reason, that the pain you endured was part of a divine plan. It's comforting. It gives chaos a narrative. But what if that belief wasn't spiritual at all, but psychological armor? Trauma-coded theology is the kind of faith born not from light, but from the desperate need to explain darkness without falling apart. When terrible things happen, abuse, loss, betrayal, the mind craves closure. It can't tolerate the idea that the world is random, unjust, or worse, indifferent. So it builds meaning, not because meaning is real, but because it's safer than staring into a void. Everything happens for a reason becomes a survival mantra, even when the reason never comes. This isn't enlightenment, it's emotional survival. A belief system formed not to elevate, but to cope. And once it's in place, it resists challenge, because to admit otherwise would unravel the fragile logic that held someone together through hell. Religions have often absorbed this trauma logic. Suffering becomes sacred. Martyrdom is glorified. Pain is rebranded as purification. But sometimes, what looks like devotion is really a disguise, a deep defense against facing the unbearable truth that cruelty might have no purpose, that trauma might just be trauma. You see it in people who cling to painful doctrines, not because they bring peace, but because they were lifelines during drowning. The belief became armor, and shedding it feels like bleeding all over again. But healing doesn't require illusion. It requires grief. And sometimes, the holiest prayer is this: maybe this should never have happened. So ask yourself, did you choose your belief, or did your pain choose it for you? Imagine running toward a distant light, thinking that just a little more effort, a little more healing, will finally make you whole. But the light keeps moving. You never arrive. That's not failure. That's design. Some belief systems sell you a journey with no finish line, where growth becomes a treadmill and healing becomes an identity. You're always becoming, never being. Spiritual markets, self-help empires, and even therapy cultures can turn healing into a product. The more you seek, the more you're told you need to seek. There's always another block, another shadow, another past life to unravel. It feels noble, but it can be a trap. Because if you're always focused on what's missing, you never see what's present. You're too busy fixing to notice the quiet truth: you were never broken. Psychologically, this aligns with the hedonic treadmill, a concept where progress never satisfies because the goalpost keeps shifting. Every breakthrough becomes a new baseline. You reach clarity, but now you want transcendence. You resolve trauma, but now you want enlightenment. And beneath it all, one toxic whisper persists: you're not enough yet. That voice adapts, just enough to keep you chasing. That whisper is profitable. It fuels courses, books, retreats. It cloaks itself as self-love, but it feeds on your doubt. You're chasing worth instead of seeing you already have it. And the world applauds, because the endless seeker is easier to market to. What if the truth isn't at the end of the quest, but in the radical act of stopping? True growth isn't endless chasing. It's seeing that who you are was never broken to begin with. Imagine being told that love means doing what you're told, that questioning is betrayal, that doubt is disobedience. From a young age, many are taught that to be loved is to comply. Not to be understood, but to be loyal. Not to be free, but to obey. And when obedience is mistaken for love, belief systems stop being about truth. They become about control. This wiring begins early, when affection is given only when you conform, when smiles follow silence and punishment follows rebellion. Your nervous system learns that safety is submission. That connection requires suppression. Over time, love becomes a transaction. I'll belong if I behave. The cost of love becomes self-erasure. In psychology, this is known as conditional regard. It's not nurturing, it's training. It wires the brain to equate acceptance with silence, belonging with obedience. And belief systems, especially in rigid families, political cults, or authoritarian religions, exploit this vulnerability. They don't need reason. They use withdrawal, guilt, exile. You're not persuaded. You're conditioned. You stay not because it feels true, but because leaving feels like emotional abandonment. Not just from others, but from the version of yourself you were told was good. That's not love. That's emotional hostage-taking dressed in sacred language. Real love invites your full self. It doesn't collapse when challenged. It listens. It expands. But a system built on fear cannot survive your questions. So it calls your doubt sin, your independence betrayal, your voice rebellion. Ask yourself, was it ever about love or just loyalty disguised as virtue? Maybe love never demanded your silence. Maybe fear did. Imagine standing at a locked door, waiting for a voice from above to tell you it's time to knock. Days pass, then years, and still nothing. But you keep waiting because you believe that one day a sign will arrive. That belief becomes your shelter and your prison. This is the divine delay excuse, the idea that destiny will tap you on the shoulder when you're ready. But it never does, because it was always waiting on you. This isn't just procrastination, it's a spiritual sedative. Not now, maybe later sounds harmless. But over time, it mutates into a belief system, a worldview that says timing is sacred, that readiness is bestowed from above, not built from within. But neuroscience tells a different story. Motivation doesn't precede action, it follows it. Your brain gains momentum after you move, not before. In psychology, this is tied to temporal discounting and avoidance coping. Your mind clings to comfort now, even when it costs your future. When you wrap this in spiritual language, delay becomes divine. You say, the universe isn't ready, when in truth it's fear whispering, don't try. The lie becomes elegant, beautiful, even holy. Every day you wait for perfect timing is a day you hand your life to fate. You surrender authorship. You give your pen to a phantom and hope it writes for you. And the longer you wait, the more sacred the delay feels, because it protects you from failure, from rejection, from responsibility. But what if the silence is the sign? What if no one is coming because it's always been you? So stop waiting for a signal that was never meant to come. You are the clock. You are the sign. The door opens the moment you knock, and not a second before. Imagine staring so long at the shadows that you begin to believe they're chasing you. That's the mind under fear. It doesn't wait for danger. It prepares for it constantly. Fear isn't passive. It's creative. It builds prophecies. Neuroscience shows that fear amplifies threat detection. You start noticing every risk, every signal, every possible wrong turn. And because attention shapes perception, your world becomes sculpted by what you dread. You attract what you fear, not because it's real, but because belief sharpens your senses toward threat and blinds you to joy. Your brain becomes a radar for danger, ignoring safety, beauty, and peace. It edits reality. You remember the pain, not the pleasure. You notice the frown, not the smile. Over time, fear creates a filter. And through that filter, the world confirms what you feared. This is the fear-forged prophecy. You think you're reading the world, but really, you're reading your own panic, projected outward. Relationships feel like traps. Dreams feel risky. Even silence feels threatening. And yet, most of it isn't real. The world isn't dangerous. It's the lens that's cracked. Fear creates a loop. The more you believe in the threat, the more you shape your world around avoiding it. And in that avoidance, you never see the joy you missed. You never felt the love that was safe. You never trusted the calm. Let go of needing to be ready for pain. Fear prepares you for war even in times of peace. But joy? Joy is no shield. It's an invitation. Imagine a thought that doesn't just exist, but survives. It spreads, adapts, and defends itself like a virus. This is the nature of parasitic beliefs. They don't just occupy your mind, they embed themselves so deeply that trying to remove them triggers pain, fear, even guilt. They create a loop. Believe, obey, repeat. And if you question them, they punish you from the inside. These are not just ideas. They're cognitive malware. Once installed, they rewrite your perception. They don't ask for space, they consume it. They whisper that without them, you'll be lost, that you'll suffer, that you're betraying something sacred, and so you stay infected, not out of logic, but out of terror, not out of love, but out of fear of deletion. This is how thought parasites work. They masquerade as truth, but act like jailers. Some come from childhood, planted by parents, teachers, pastors. Others arrive wrapped in ideology, disguised as values, tradition, or identity. But once inside, they hijack the host. Your free will becomes their puppet. You repeat them without realizing they were never truly yours. Think of high-control religions, abusive family rules, toxic productivity mindsets. Each one installs a belief that flinches when challenged. You'll go to hell. You're ungrateful. You're lazy. These aren't arguments. They're tripwires, psychological landmines that keep you obedient. Trying to remove a thought parasite doesn't just hurt, it feels like ripping out a piece of who you are. That's the trap. It fuses with identity. But freedom doesn't come from obeying your fear. It comes from recognizing the loop, naming it, and stepping beyond its grasp. So ask yourself, what belief causes pain when you challenge it? That's not truth. That's the parasite screaming not to die. Imagine suffering deeply, then being told you deserve it, not because of anything you've done, but because of something vague, cosmic, or from another life. That's not wisdom. That's violence wrapped in spiritual language. Karma, once a concept of cause and effect, has too often been twisted into a tool for blame. When misunderstood or misused, it stops being guidance and starts becoming cruelty disguised as balance and insight. In its original form, karma wasn't punishment. It was reflection, an invitation to examine the ripples of your actions. But modern spiritual circles and pseudo-wisdom gurus have repackaged karma into a moral scoreboard. If you're poor, sick, or grieving, it's because you attracted it. If you're hurting, it's because you needed the lesson. This isn't healing. It's spiritual gaslighting with a mantra. Psychologically, this functions like just world bias, the belief that people get what they deserve. It makes the world feel safer, predictable. But it also blinds us to real injustice. It shifts blame from systems to individuals, from abusers to survivors. It makes suffering a verdict instead of a call for compassion, reinforcing the lie that pain equals guilt. A child suffers abuse, and we're told it's karmic debt. That's not justice. That's delusion. Karma should guide awareness, not silence pain. It should inspire action, not justify apathy. When someone is hurting, the question is not, what did they do to deserve this? But, how can we help carry the weight? Real karma is not a cage. It's a mirror. And no one deserves to be broken in the name of reflection, redemption, or some imagined universal balance. Radical compassion is the truest karma. Imagine meeting someone who claims to believe only in logic, facts, reason, evidence. They dismiss faith, reject emotion, and pride themselves on being rational. But look closer, and something strange appears. Their logic always leads to the same emotional conclusion. The facts they select protect their comfort. Their arguments defend their fear. That's the logic trap, when reason becomes camouflage for emotional rigidity. In psychology, this is known as motivated reasoning. The brain doesn't seek truth, it seeks coherence. It filters information to support what it already feels and fears. And even the most logical-seeming belief systems can act as shields. You're not analyzing, you're armoring. You're building an impenetrable case to justify emotional resistance while calling it intelligence. Think of conspiracy theorists who weaponize data to build illusions, or ideologues who construct elaborate arguments but never shift an inch. The more rational they sound, the more immovable they become. Because it was never about finding truth, it was about preserving emotional control. And control is always personal. Rationality, when divorced from self-awareness, becomes its own dogma, worshipped, unchallenged, and insulated from doubt. When logic is no longer used to explore but only to defend, it stops being a tool and becomes a cage, a belief disguised as objectivity. So ask yourself, Is your logic alive, curious, willing to evolve? Or is it just a more polished form of fear? Sometimes the most dangerous belief is the one that pretends it isn't one. And sometimes the deepest bias wears the mask of reason. Imagine someone drowning in self doubt, reaching not for a life raft but for a lullaby. Not a solution, just the soft voice that says, "You're still good." That voice becomes sacred, not because it's true, but because it soothes. This is how reassurance becomes religion. Some people don't want truth, they want relief. They don't seek transformation, they seek comfort. The facts don't matter as much as the feeling. If a belief makes them feel safe, they'll wear it like armor, even if it blinds them. This is the psychology of emotional confirmation. We don't just want to be right, we want to be okay. Neurologically, the brain is designed to avoid cognitive dissonance, the discomfort of holding conflicting truths. So when we're hurting, anxious, or lost, we crave stories that erase that tension. We listen to anything that tells us we're fine, even if we're not. Reassurance activates reward circuits. Dopamine releases, cortisol drops. It feels like love. It feels like truth. But it isn't. That's why people follow gurus who tell them what they want to hear. Why they reject hard truths in favor of soft lies. Why they stay in echo chambers where no one dares question their goodness. They're not building knowledge, they're building shelter. But if your beliefs can't survive without constant reassurance, they aren't beliefs, they're security blankets. And if your self-worth needs a script to prove you're good, it's not self-worth, it's dependence. True growth begins when you can hear uncomfortable truth and not flinch. When you can face the mirror and not need it to smile back. Because being good isn't the goal. Being honest is. So ask yourself, are you seeking truth or just someone to whisper that you're enough? Imagine being handed a golden crown, but it's welded to a cage. That's the "I'm special" program. It tells you you're chosen, different, elevated. At first, it feels empowering. You matter. You're destined. But underneath that glow is a quiet trap, isolation. Because once you believe you're special, you must constantly prove it. You can't be ordinary. You can't rest. You must earn your place every day. Psychology shows that superiority beliefs often mask deep insecurity. You're not rising above others. You're running from the fear that you're not enough without performance. And here's the paradox. The more special you believe you must be, the less connected you feel. You become an actor in your own life, always on stage, never exhaling. Relationships turn into competitions. Rest feels like failure. You can't ask for help because chosen ones don't struggle. You wear the crown and the mask. But the mask hides your real self, and the crown is heavier than anyone knows. Real worth isn't earned through excellence. It's revealed through honesty, vulnerability, and the courage to be seen without applause. You were never meant to be special. You were meant to be whole. And wholeness doesn't isolate, it connects. It says, you don't need a crown to matter. You don't need to stand out to be loved. When you let go of the need to be exceptional, you finally return to something deeper than recognition. Peace. Not the kind earned by proving, but the kind that was waiting when you stopped performing. The real self isn't special, it's human. And being human, fully and without pretense, is already more than enough. That is your truth. You don't need to be chosen, just here. Imagine needing to repeat something every single day just to believe it's true. Not because it's obvious, not because it's real, but because without the ritual, it crumbles. This is the repetition trap. If your belief needs daily affirmation to survive, it's not truth, it's maintenance. Affirmations, mantras, chants, they feel powerful. But often, they're not about conviction. They're about preservation. Like a fire that needs constant fuel, these thoughts wither without attention. And that's the clue. Truth doesn't beg to be repeated. It just is. You don't wake up each day reminding yourself gravity exists, but you do wake up whispering, I am enough. I am worthy. I am safe. Why? Because some part of you doesn't fully believe it. Not yet. This doesn't mean rituals are bad. They can soothe, heal, and anchor us in chaos. But there's a quiet line between repetition as nourishment and repetition as denial. One feeds the soul. The other covers a fracture the mind refuses to face. The repetition becomes armor, not to protect belief, but to protect the fear hiding underneath. Psychologists call this cognitive reinforcement. The brain clings hardest to what it secretly doubts. The more fragile a belief, the more fiercely we chant it. And over time, we confuse repetition with reality. But belief shouldn't be a cage you lock with words. It should breathe, grow, and withstand silence. So the next time you find yourself repeating something again and again, pause and ask, am I building inner strength or covering inner fear? Am I reinforcing a truth or protecting a wound too painful to name? A truth doesn't need fuel, but a fragile belief always does. And eventually, the more you echo it, the more the sound starts to question itself. Imagine putting on a jacket, not because it keeps you warm, but because it gets you compliments. Now imagine that jacket is your morality. In today's world, belief isn't just about what's true, it's about what looks good. Morality becomes branding, conviction becomes performance, and ethics get replaced by optics and applause. You say the right things, wear the right causes, post the right hashtags, not to create change, but to be seen as the kind of person who would. This isn't just hypocrisy, it's identity marketing. When beliefs become aesthetic, they lose their roots. You start signaling virtue instead of living it. The compass becomes a costume. Psychologists call this impression management. It's the instinct to curate how we're perceived, especially in public. But social media amplifies it. It rewards outrage, not understanding. Slogans, not substance. You don't need to be kind. You just need to look compassionate. You don't need to help. You just need to align with the right narrative at the right time. Soon, morality stops guiding behavior. It guides branding. You condemn the right villains. Support trending victims, even if you only learned their names yesterday. You perform empathy. You echo the algorithm. And somewhere, in that noise, your true values get replaced with applause, metrics, and the shallow illusion of virtue. But real morality isn't glamorous. It's quiet. It means doing the right thing when no one's watching. It means choosing truth when it costs you. And it means stripping off the costume, standing in your ethics, not dressing in them. The question isn't, does this look good on me? The question is, would I still believe this if it earned me nothing? Imagine walking into a place that tells you you're sick, so they can sell you the cure, that you're broken, so they can fix you, that you're unworthy, so they can offer salvation. But what if you were never broken in the first place? Some belief systems aren't built on love or truth. They're built on guilt. And guilt is a powerful business model because it keeps you coming back. The strategy is ancient. Create a wound, then offer the bandage. Teach you to feel shame for being human, imperfect, curious, emotional, and then present themselves as the only path to redemption. This isn't healing, it's dependency. And the conditioning often begins in childhood when your brain is still forming its sense of self. In many families, institutions, and traditions, guilt is installed like malware. You're told that wanting is selfish, that anger is sinful, that questioning is rebellion. And each time you step outside the script, you feel the sting, not because you did something wrong, but because you were trained to believe you did. Psychologically, this creates a closed loop. Guilt triggers obedience. Obedience reinforces belief, and belief demands more guilt. You confuse comfort with truth. You mistake familiar pain for virtue, and the loop spins on. But here's the question that breaks it. What if you're not broken? What if that constant guilt isn't proof of sin, but evidence of manipulation? Real healing doesn't require guilt to begin with. It doesn't need shame to spark transformation. It begins where judgment ends, and it asks nothing from you except honesty, presence, and the courage to stop apologizing for existing. Maybe you don't need to be fixed. Maybe you just need to remember. You were whole before they taught you otherwise. Imagine someone claiming they've awakened, not whispering it with humility, but broadcasting it like a badge. They've seen the light, and now they want everyone to know. But what if that awakening isn't transcendence? What if it's ego wearing a robe? Even spiritual awakenings can become ego trips. The mind takes the most sacred moments and turns them into status. Suddenly, enlightenment isn't about truth, it's about identity. I'm more aware than you. I've transcended. I see the illusion, and you don't. It's no longer a journey, it's a trophy. Psychologically, this is called spiritual bypassing, using awakening not to dissolve the self, but to inflate it. The ego adapts. It learns the language of light, but keeps the same agenda, to be special, superior, right. It wraps itself in mantras, quotes, rituals, but underneath, it's still grasping for validation. And in social circles, this becomes a signal. Wisdom becomes performance. Humility becomes branding. Meditation becomes a metric. People compete over who's more awakened, who's let go more, who's healed deeper wounds. It's not transformation, it's theater. Neurologically, the brain rewards identity reinforcement. When your sense of self is praised, dopamine fires. And the more people admire your awakening, the more your ego clings to it. But real awakening? It has no need to announce itself. It doesn't decorate. It dissolves. True awareness strips away identity, not adds to it. It doesn't say, I am awake. It asks, who is the I that thinks it's awake? That's the difference between a path and a pedestal. So before you wear your awakening like a crown, ask, is this freedom or just a shinier form of self? Imagine a wall that wasn't built to protect, but to decide who gets to climb over it. That's what the concept of sin often becomes. It begins as morality, but ends as a structure, one that defines who is guilty, who is pure, who has the right to forgive, and who gets to lead. Sin draws a line, and power stands on one side of it. Across history, the definition of sin has rarely been neutral. It shifts to suit those who define it. What's sin in one era becomes law in another. What's condemned for one group is permitted for another. This isn't accidental, it's structural. The concept of sin becomes a tool, not just to define wrong, but to maintain hierarchy. Who gets to forgive? The priest. Who gets to save? The Savior. Who decides guilt? The institution. Sin creates a system where redemption is rationed and access to grace is mediated by power. The more broken you are told you are, the more dependent you become on those who claim to fix you. That's not morality, that's control, and it hides beneath the language of virtue. This structure punishes not just actions, but autonomy. It's why questioning authority can itself be framed as sin. It's why obedience becomes sacred and doubt becomes dangerous. But real morality doesn't need a gatekeeper. It doesn't require fear to function. The moment you need someone else to permit your redemption, you've given them your soul. True ethics begin when control ends. When the wall is torn down, not to erase accountability, but to remove the throne built on guilt. You were never broken. Imagine waking up and wondering if everything around you is fake. The sky, your friends, your memories, all part of a simulation. It sounds like science fiction, but for many it's become a genuine worldview, one that strips life of its weight. Because if this is all code, why care? Why suffer? Why try? But here's the question most forget to ask. Who benefits from you believing nothing matters? The simulation belief often begins as a coping mechanism. The world feels cruel, chaotic, senseless, so you seek structure, even if that structure says you're inside a machine. It gives you detachment, a buffer. But detachment is dangerous when it calcifies into apathy. When everything becomes fiction, effort feels pointless. Pain becomes just data. Injustice becomes a glitch. And you become a spectator in your own existence. Philosophically, it mirrors nihilism, but wrapped in digital skin. And just like any belief, it comes with consequences. The more you whisper, none of this is real, the easier it becomes to disconnect. to numb yourself, to stop acting when action is needed most. And here's where it turns insidious. If you truly believe nothing matters, you become easy to manipulate, easy to control, passive, disconnected. A system, real or simulated, thrives on obedient minds that stop questioning, stop hoping, stop resisting. So before you surrender to the comfort of the unreal, ask yourself, who profits from your disconnection? Who gains from your silence? Belief is powerful, but some beliefs don't set you free. They sedate you. Not everything meaningless is harmless. Even in a simulation, choice has weight. Morality echoes, and consciousness still suffers. So ask, do you believe this because it's true or because it's safer than hoping the world is real? Imagine being born into a play where your role was already written. Helper, sinner, teacher, martyr. You never chose the part, but you're expected to perform it. This is how many belief systems operate. They hand you a cosmic chore chart. Be good, be small, be sacrificial, play your part, and maybe you'll earn worth. But don't question the script, or you'll be accused of rebellion. Religions, cultures, and even families often hand down identities like inherited furniture. You become the strong one, the obedient one, the broken one who needs saving. You're not praised for who you are, but for how well you perform. And if you ever dare step off script, if you stop giving, stop suffering, stop apologizing, you're called selfish, lost, even evil. Because you weren't just assigned a role. You were told that role was your virtue, your ticket to love. Psychologists call this role entrapment. It's when your value is tied to how well you conform. And it's everywhere. From the dutiful daughter to the silent son, from the healer who never heals herself to the martyr who burns out in silence. You serve others while slowly disappearing from yourself, ghosting through a life that doesn't feel like yours. You become applause, not identity. But here's the truth. Roles are written by people, not the universe. Scripts aren't sacred, just recycled myths in costume, passed down through tired generations. You were not born to play a part. You were born to choose, to rewrite, to break type. So ask yourself, who benefits when you stay in your role? And what happens if you stop playing? Because the moment you pick up the pen and start rewriting, the performance ends and the real life begins. Imagine holding on to a rope that's burning your hands, but you won't let go because hope keeps whispering, just a little longer. That's what toxic systems feed on. Not fear, not logic. Hope. Hope that things will change, that the people will change, that if you just endure one more day, it will all finally make sense. Just one more prayer, one more sacrifice, one more chance. But what if hope isn't healing you? What if it's keeping you trapped? In psychology, this is known as intermittent reinforcement. When pain and pleasure alternate unpredictably, the brain gets hooked, like a gambler chasing a jackpot. You don't stay because it's good. You stay because it was good once, or might be again. Hope becomes a leash, not a light. You wait for the next high of affection, of approval, of relief. And that waiting rewires you. Toxic systems, whether relationships, religions, or ideologies, leverage this pattern with surgical precision. They promise breakthrough, peace, transformation, just around the corner. After this ritual, after this confession, after you prove your worth again. And when nothing changes, they say the failure was yours. You didn't try hard enough. You didn't believe enough. So you double down, because walking away feels like giving up on something sacred. But here's the truth. If the hope of change is the only thing keeping you there, then it's not love. It's addiction. Real hope doesn't require suffering as evidence. It doesn't silence your needs. It doesn't keep shifting the finish line. It invites growth, not self-abandonment. Ask yourself, is your hope healing you or just helping you survive something that should have ended long ago? Sometimes letting go isn't quitting. Sometimes it's the most radical act of healing you'll ever commit. Imagine being handed a broken machine, and when it fails, you're told it's your fault. You didn't build it. You didn't design it. But you're made to feel defective for not making it work. This is the blame shift doctrine, where systems offload their failures onto individuals, and guilt becomes the glue that holds the illusion together. You're taught to blame yourself so the system stays clean. If the school fails you, you're lazy. If work crushes you, you're weak. If society marginalizes you, you just need to try harder. The structure stays sacred while your identity gets dismantled. This keeps the gears turning, quiet, controlled. Psychologically, this creates what's called internalized oppression. You adopt the criticism meant to control you. Instead of questioning the system, you question your worth. Guilt becomes a silencer, killing rebellion before it even speaks. And because it feels moral, it's hard to notice its manipulation. Forgiveness, in this setup, isn't a path to healing. It's a reward granted by power. You earn it only after accepting blame, apologize, obey, perform remorse. Then maybe you'll be forgiven. But not for your growth, for their comfort. Because if you blame yourself, they never have to change. And if they don't have to change, nothing ever will. This is how institutions maintain order, by moralizing submission. Churches, corporations, schools, they call it humility, repentance, discipline. But often, it's just emotional manipulation dressed in virtue. It looks like guidance, but it's really control. Real liberation begins when you stop swallowing guilt that was never yours to begin with, when you realize the system isn't broken, it was built this way, and it runs on your silence. So next time you feel guilt, pause, ask, is this mine, or was it handed to me to keep the machine running? Imagine standing at a traffic light that never turns green. You wait and wait for someone to say you can be happy, for someone to say you deserve love, for someone to let you live. That's the silent damage of permission-based existence. Some beliefs don't just teach you what's right, they teach you to wait for validation, for approval, for some authority, divine, parental, cultural, to say, now you're enough, and so you pause your joy, postpone your peace, delay your dreams, because you were trained to believe freedom is something given to you, not something already inside you. This mindset creates dependency. You scan faces, rules, rituals, hoping to be seen, chosen, allowed. But no one ever arrives with that permission slip. The truth is brutal and freeing. No one can authorize your worth. No one can certify your right to be happy. You're not waiting for permission. You're waiting for courage. And courage doesn't come from outside. It comes the moment you stop asking and start choosing. The green light isn't broken. It was never real. The rules you thought you needed to follow were written to keep you small. And they will never say, go. Not because you're not ready, but because they were never meant to. The question isn't whether someone will allow you to live. The question is whether you will. True freedom begins when you stop seeking permission and give it instead to yourself, to your voice, to your joy. The power to begin was always yours. It still is. You had the keys. Imagine working your whole life for a paycheck that never arrives. Every time you ask, you're told, it's coming. Just wait. This is the architecture of many belief systems, eternal rewards, promised after death, heaven, enlightenment, rebirth, as if the true joy of existence must be postponed. But what if those promises are just IOUs, signed by ideas that never intended to pay you back? This is the reward postponement trap. A structure built not to elevate you, but to delay you. To push happiness so far into the future that you forget it was supposed to happen now. You're taught to endure, to suffer nobly, to wait, because someday it'll all make sense. Someday you'll be rewarded, but someday never shows up. Only discipline, obedience, and quiet resignation remain. Psychologically, this taps into the brain's reward circuitry. Future hope soothes present pain. But that same mechanism can be hijacked, used to control. It turns your joy into a distant goalpost, always out of reach. The longer you wait, the more invested you become. The more you sacrifice, the harder it is to ask, was this delay a virtue or a trap? You start to wonder if the suffering was the point all along, because if you woke up and realized that life is the reward, raw, imperfect, chaotic, beautiful, you might stop obeying, you might stop shrinking, you might stop buying into systems that thrive on your patience but never offer a rival. So ask yourself, who taught you that joy must wait? Who told you heaven comes later? And what would happen if you stopped waiting and started living? Maybe paradise isn't after. Maybe it was always supposed to be here, and they just convinced you to look away. Imagine kneeling in a storm, thinking the longer you endure it, the more worthy you become. That every bruise, every heartbreak, every failure is currency for something higher. This is the trap of sacred suffering, the belief that pain makes you pure, holy, enlightened. That staying hurts less than walking away from what breaks you, because leaving feels like failure. Religions, traditions, and cultures have often painted suffering as noble. Saints starved, martyrs burned, prophets wept. And in their shadows, we learn that hurt is holy, that to suffer is to earn virtue, that enduring pain is a kind of devotion. But devotion to what? Psychologically, this can lock people in cycles of self-sacrifice. You begin to believe that joy is naive, happiness is shallow, and peace is unearned unless it follows agony. So you stay in the toxic job, the abusive relationship, the punishing silence, because leaving feels like betrayal to the story that told you pain is proof of goodness. This belief often shows up as spiritual bypassing, a refusal to heal because the suffering itself is mistaken for growth. But pain isn't always a teacher. Sometimes it's just damage. And staying in it doesn't make you stronger. It just wears you down. Suffering is part of life, yes, but it's not a ladder to holiness or a stairway to redemption. You don't need scars to prove your depth or endless bruises to validate your becoming. You don't owe the world your exhaustion as evidence of love. Sometimes, the most sacred thing you'll ever do is walk away with quiet defiance. Not because you've given up, but because you've finally remembered your soul wasn't meant to live in chains. Imagine being handed a map that divides the world into two colors, good and evil. Simple, clear, comforting, but entirely false. That's how binary morality works. It reduces the chaos of life into neat categories. What you agree with is good. What threatens your beliefs becomes evil. It feels righteous, but it's often just rehearsed, not realized. This isn't moral clarity, it's cognitive simplicity. And the brain loves simplicity. Neuroscience shows we're wired to reduce complexity into dualities, safe versus unsafe, us versus them, right versus wrong. It saves time. It feels secure, but it flattens reality. It turns human beings into symbols. It turns systems into gods. It kills nuance, and in killing nuance, it kills empathy. Most people never stop to realize their definition of good is based entirely on what affirms their worldview. You were taught certain actions, values, and people were noble, not because they objectively are, but because they matched the script passed down to you. Everything outside that script? Suspicious, corrupt, evil. Not because it is, but because it threatens your inherited sense of order. This binary mindset isn't just lazy, it's dangerous. It breeds polarization, justifies cruelty, silences curiosity. It makes violence feel like virtue, because if they are evil, then anything is justified to stop them. But reality doesn't play by those rules. It's messy, layered, uncomfortable, paradoxical. Real morality requires discomfort. It demands patience. It asks you to think slowly, to feel deeply, to listen longer than is comfortable. What if good versus evil is just a frame, a lens, not a law? Maybe morality isn't a line, it's a landscape. And maybe walking it means dropping the map and meeting people where they actually stand. Imagine a child told to stay quiet at the dinner table, not because they've done anything wrong, but because silence keeps things smooth. Over time, they learn a dangerous equation. Peace equals obedience. Agreement equals love. Discomfort equals danger. They grow up believing that if they disagree, they're breaking something sacred. You were taught that peace comes from agreeing, from lowering your voice, from nodding even when your soul says no. But what if peace doesn't come from compliance? What if real peace begins the moment you finally break away? Psychologically, this is tied to fawning, a trauma response where you make yourself small to stay safe. You smile when you're hurting. You say yes when everything in you screams no. It looks like harmony, but it's really fear in disguise. You're not protecting peace, you're abandoning yourself. Compliance becomes a virtue, politeness becomes a cage, and the system loves it that way. Quiet people don't question. Quiet people keep the gears turning. But inside, the cost is enormous. Stress, burnout, a life unlived. Neuroscience shows that chronically suppressing your truth activates survival mode. Your body treats your silence like a threat it must constantly manage. And over time, that tension builds, not into peace, but into quiet despair. True peace is not the absence of noise, it's the presence of authenticity. It doesn't come from keeping things calm. It comes from making space for the real. Real peace allows for disagreement, for boundaries, for honesty without punishment. It doesn't ask you to shrink. It invites you to stand. So the next time you feel proud for keeping things peaceful, pause. Ask yourself, is this peace or just the absence of my truth? Imagine being punished for hunger, not because you took too much, but because you dared to feel it at all. That's how some belief systems treat desire. Wanting is cast as weakness. Craving beauty, joy, or love becomes a flaw. You're told it's dangerous. You're warned it will corrupt you. But desire isn't corruption. It's ignition. It's the signal that you're still alive. Biologically, emotionally, spiritually, desire is movement. It's the current that pulls you forward. Without it, you don't evolve. You stagnate. Systems that fear desire often seek control, because a person who wants nothing is easier to manage. So we learn to suppress the instinct to reach, to long, to burn for more. But repression doesn't create peace. It creates shame. And shame festers. You start to hide your dreams. You flinch at your own joy. You begin to apologize for wanting to be fully alive. But desire, real desire, isn't greed. It's gravity. It's the soul leaning toward what nourishes it. The truth is, wanting beauty doesn't make you selfish. It makes you sensitive. Wanting love doesn't make you weak. It makes you human. And craving joy isn't sin. It's survival. The danger was never in the desire itself. The danger was in believing you had to kill it to be good. You don't. You never did. The world was never meant to be endured. It was meant to be touched, tasted, and deeply felt. So want. Want loudly. Want without shame. Because the moment you stop apologizing for your desire is the moment you start living like you deserve to. Desire isn't a flaw to silence. It's the compass of your becoming. And if you follow it honestly, not recklessly, it leads you to the life that's truly yours. Imagine taking a pill that doesn't heal you, but makes you feel like everything's fine. You take it again and again. Not because it's true, but because it soothes you. That's how belief becomes addiction. Not all beliefs are about truth. Some are emotional drugs, little hits of certainty, control, or comfort in a world that makes no promises. Once a belief comforts you, it becomes sticky. The brain begins to associate it with relief, like a smoker reaching for a cigarette during stress. Over time, you don't just hold the belief, you depend on it. You'll bend logic, ignore facts, even distort memories just to keep the emotional high alive. This is the belief addiction spiral. The more it comforts, the less you question. And the less you question, the deeper it buries itself into your identity. Questioning it begins to feel like betrayal. Letting it go feels like losing a part of yourself. And that's the trap. The belief doesn't have to be true. It just has to feel good enough to silence your fear. Neurologically, it's reinforcement. The brain rewards emotional resolution, not accuracy. So even harmful or limiting beliefs, I deserve this pain, they're the enemy, I'll never be enough, can become addictive if they provide a framework that makes suffering feel organized. The comfort becomes the cage. The lie becomes the leash. And the worst part? You start to defend the belief, not because it's wise, but because losing it means facing raw uncertainty, chaos, emotional withdrawal, a silence that feels unbearable. You fight to keep it because without it, your identity trembles. So ask yourself, what belief do you protect, not because it's true, but because you're scared of the silence it would leave behind? The answer might terrify you, but it might also free you. Imagine taking a drug that makes you feel powerful, certain, superior. It sharpens your voice, stiffens your spine, and convinces you that you alone see the truth. That's what righteousness does. It's not just a belief, it's a high, a spiritual adrenaline rush that disguises itself as clarity. The rush of being right activates reward centers in the brain. Neuroscience shows that moral certainty lights up the same regions as food, sex, and addictive substances. It feels good to be righteous, addictively good, and once you're hooked, doubt feels like weakness, humility feels like betrayal. But here's the catch. Righteousness narrows your vision. It makes you deaf to complexity, blind to nuance. You begin filtering the world through a single lens, one that flatters your identity and dismisses anything that doesn't. Confirmation bias becomes your compass, and curiosity becomes a threat. Everyone who disagrees isn't just wrong, they're dangerous, ignorant, evil. That's why righteous people rarely change their minds. They're not thinking, they're defending a high. And the more that high is threatened, the louder they scream. The more facts you present, the tighter they grip their worldview. Because the truth was never the goal, ego was. Righteousness, unchecked, becomes self-worship. You mistake conviction for wisdom. And in the end, you become a preacher with no ears, a thinker with no questions. Real clarity doesn't come from being right. It comes from being brave enough to grow from mistakes. Imagine pointing at a monster, loud, certain, righteous, while secretly trying not to notice it looks a little like you. That's the hidden machinery behind projection. When we're afraid to face what's inside us, we turn it into something out there. We build villains to make our own shadows easier to ignore, and the more terrifying they look, the less we have to look inward. Psychologically, this is called shadow projection. Carl Jung described the shadow as the parts of ourselves we disown, our rage, jealousy, fear, selfishness. Not because they're evil, but because we were taught they were unacceptable. So we bury them. And what's disowned doesn't vanish. It festers. It leaks. It distorts. It gets assigned to someone else, an enemy, a threat, a scapegoat. You label someone as dangerous, not because they truly are, but because they reflect something unresolved in you. You fight them harder, louder, more viciously, because on some level, you're terrified of what they reveal. The enemy becomes a mirror, and you spend your life smashing glass instead of seeing yourself. Belief systems, especially rigid ones, can hard-code this process. They give you villains, sinners, outsiders. They tell you who to blame, who to condemn. And in doing so, they protect your inner chaos from ever being faced. Morality becomes a mask. Outrage becomes a drug. Righteousness becomes denial. But real growth doesn't come from defeating what's outside. It comes from turning inward and asking, which of these battles began in me? Maybe the evil you're fighting isn't evil at all. Maybe it's just pain. Your pain, wearing a disguise. And maybe healing doesn't mean slaying the shadow, but listening to it and letting it finally come home. Imagine holding a rope that's burning your hands. You know you should let go, but you've held it for so long, through so much pain, that releasing it feels like betrayal. Not of the rope, but of yourself. That's the emotional investment defense. The more you pour into a belief, the harder it is to walk away, even when it hurts you. You don't defend a belief just because it's true. You defend it because it's yours. You built memories around it, fought arguments for it. Maybe you even shaped your identity around it. And now, admitting it might be wrong doesn't just threaten an idea, it threatens everything built on top of it. Psychologically, this is called the sunk cost fallacy. The brain values effort, time, and emotion already spent, even if the outcome is flawed. The more you've invested in a story, the more sacred it becomes. Letting it go feels like erasing a part of yourself. This is why people stay in broken relationships, defend disproven ideologies, or cling to outdated dreams. It's not ignorance, it's grief avoidance. Because walking away means mourning not just what was, but what could have been. Neurologically, your sense of self attaches to consistent narratives. Dissonance, conflicting truths, feels like identity collapse. So instead of shifting, you double down. You argue louder. You push facts away. Not because you hate truth, but because you fear the collapse of who you've become. But real growth requires loss, not of who you are, but of who you were told to be. Letting go isn't failure. It's a sign you're strong enough to value truth more than your past. So ask yourself, do I believe this because it's true, or because I've tied too much of myself to it? Imagine being handed a key and told it unlocks a secret door, one that only a few will ever pass through. That's the promise of elitist belief systems. They don't just comfort you, they elevate you. You're not just good. You're chosen, not just lucky, but selected by fate or God or truth itself. It feels empowering, special, safe. But here's the trap. The more convinced you are that you're part of the chosen few, the less likely you are to question who built the door, who wrote the rules, and who benefits from your belief in the gate. Elitism isn't just a mindset, it's a mechanism. It trains you to see others as less evolved, less saved, less deserving. It wraps your identity in superiority and calls it divine order. And the cost? Empathy, curiosity, the willingness to see truth beyond the script. These systems rarely survive because they're true. They survive because they flatter. They reward compliance with the illusion of elevation. But what if the whole structure was built to keep you obedient by making you feel elite? What if you're not special? You're just sedated. Real truth doesn't isolate. It expands. It humbles. It burns down the walls that tell you only a few deserve light. If a belief requires others to be inferior so you can feel superior, it's not enlightenment, it's ego maintenance. The real test of growth isn't how high you climb inside the system. It's whether you're willing to dismantle the ladder entirely. The door was never locked. You were never chosen. You were always free. And so is everyone else. The moment you stop needing to be special is when you become real. And in that realness, you finally belong. No gate, no test, just truth. Imagine being praised not when you rise, but when you shrink. Told you're wise, not when you speak your truth, but when you bite your tongue. Called humble, not when you act with grace, but when you submit. This isn't humility. It's indoctrinated obedience, dressed up as virtue. From a young age, many are taught that shrinking is noble, that silence is spiritual, that self-erasure is strength. But this isn't humility, it's control. A rewiring of your self-worth, where every step you take inward is seen as moral progress, where diminishing your light is called good character. Real humility is honest. It admits mistakes, respects others, remains open. But what many are taught is something else entirely. They're taught to apologize for their needs, to defer even when they're right, to feel guilty for being visible, angry, or proud. And that kind of humility has nothing to do with virtue. It has everything to do with compliance and emotional domestication. Psychologists call this internalized suppression. Over time, you begin to police yourself. You silence your own voice before anyone else has to. And because it's framed as moral, you feel pride in your shrinking. You believe you're growing, when really, you're folding. When really, you're disappearing. The result? A life where obedience feels like goodness, where saying yes when you mean no feels spiritual, where your inner fire becomes a secret you're ashamed to show. You learn to bow before expectations and call it enlightenment. So ask yourself, did you choose your humility, or were you trained to fear your own power? Because humility isn't self-erasure, and obedience isn't always sacred. Sometimes calling it virtue is just a way to keep you small, silent, and easy to manage. Imagine walking into a temple to worship the flame, but bowing instead to the ashes. The fire is gone, the warmth forgotten, yet the ritual continues. That's what happens when symbols outlive their meaning. They become hollow performances, repeated not out of truth, but out of habit. A flag once meant unity. Now it can mean division. A cross once pointed toward love and sacrifice. Now it's branded on war. A word like freedom becomes a slogan, stripped of nuance, sold in speeches, and stamped on weapons. The deeper meaning burns away, but the image remains, and we cling to that image as if it still carries the fire. Psychologically, humans crave symbols. They're shortcuts, emotional anchors. But over time, those anchors stop holding truth and start dragging us into illusion. We protect the shape instead of the spirit. We defend statues, not justice. We memorize prayers, not compassion. We repeat traditions without remembering why they began, chanting words we no longer question, preserving rituals long divorced from the truth that birthed them. This is symbolic fixation. The mind confuses appearance with essence. We worship the wrapper, forget the gift, then teach others to guard it like it holds meaning deep. The symbol becomes safer than the truth it once represented, because truth evolves, while symbols can be frozen. Ritual isn't the enemy, but ritual without reflection is. A symbol should point you inward, not trap you outward. It should awaken, not sedate. So ask yourself, have you fallen in love with the ashes, or do you still remember the fire? Because the truth was never in the shape. It lived in the spark. Imagine being taught to distrust your own voice, to silence your instincts, to fear your desires, not by accident, but by design. Some belief systems don't just limit you, they train you to become your own jailer. You internalize the war, and once that war is inside you, they don't need to control you anymore. You'll do it for them. Every time you suppress a feeling, every time you shrink yourself, that's the system working through you. It starts subtly. A raised eyebrow, a cold silence, a warning wrapped in love. You learn that wanting is dangerous, that anger is wrong, that questioning means betrayal. Over time, your inner world fractures. One part of you feels, another part attacks. Belief becomes a sword, and you're taught to cut away the parts of you that don't conform. Psychologists call this inner split self-alienation. When your conscious mind is weaponized against your deeper truth, not to protect you, but to control you, you start monitoring your thoughts, editing your emotions, erasing your needs, not because they're harmful, but because you were told they are. You become both prisoner and guard, both the wound and the hand pressing on it. The system doesn't need bars or walls. It uses guilt. It uses shame. It whispers, if you were truly good, you wouldn't feel this way. And so, you begin to fight yourself. You call it discipline, but it's self-rejection, learned so early you forgot it had a source. But here's the truth. Becoming yourself isn't about obedience, it's about integration. You don't heal by silencing your soul. You heal by making space for all of it, even the parts you were taught to fear. Maybe you were never broken, just convinced that your truth was the enemy. Imagine standing at a crossroads, unsure where to go, when a voice shouts from a distance, "This way!" You don't know if it's right, but it's confident. And in the absence of certainty, confidence feels like truth. That's the authority anchor. You keep returning to an outside voice, not because it's wise, but because it's louder than your own. From childhood, we're trained to look up. Parents, teachers, leaders, experts. And in doing so, we often stop looking in. When faced with doubt, We reach for the nearest authority to ease our fear of being wrong. The mind confuses clarity with volume, and we surrender to whoever sounds most certain. It's not guidance, it's relief, dressed as wisdom. Psychologically, this is a bias toward perceived competence. Studies show we're more likely to trust people who speak with confidence, even when they're wrong. Loud becomes right, quiet becomes invisible, and slowly we begin to distrust our inner compass. Over time, you stop asking, "What do I know?" and start asking, "What would they say?" The danger: some authorities aren't wise, they're just practiced at performing certainty. They speak in absolutes, offer packaged truths, and punish doubt. And we confuse dominance for insight. We confuse charisma for clarity. Neuroscience reveals that constant deference to external authority shrinks self-trust pathways. Your intuition atrophies. Your confidence fades. And soon, you can't tell the difference between following guidance and abandoning yourself. But wisdom doesn't always raise its voice. It doesn't demand, it invites. True guidance doesn't replace your thinking. It deepens it. It doesn't override your instinct. It sharpens it. So the next time a voice outside you feels louder than the one within, pause. Ask, are they leading me or just drowning me out? Imagine being promised paradise, but only after your life is over. Eternal joy, perfect peace, a forever reward. It sounds divine, but what if it's bait? What if the promise of eternity is used to keep you quiet, obedient, compliant, in this one brief moment you actually have? Across belief systems, the idea of eternal life offers hope, but it also creates leverage. It says, suffer now, be silent now, obey now, because later you'll be rewarded, later you'll understand, later you'll matter. But that later never comes, not because eternity isn't real, but because your life becomes a rehearsal for a story you never get to write. You trade presence for promise. You postpone meaning. You endure systems that use eternity as a leash, and you call it faith. But real faith isn't fear in disguise. It doesn't dangle heaven like a prize for obedience. It asks you to live fully, now. Because now is the only place where your hands can touch, your eyes can weep, your voice can rise. If you must erase now to secure forever, ask yourself, who profits from your waiting? Who gains when you suffer quietly? The divine shouldn't feel like a trap. It shouldn't feel like a contract with fine print. Your worth isn't delayed by death. You were not made to wait your whole life to feel alive. Eternity doesn't start later. Eternity starts now. It always did. Now. Imagine believing something simply because it hurts, because it wounds you, burdens you, breaks you. And you think, if it hurts this much, it must be true. This is the pain as proof system. The illusion that suffering validates a belief, that the deeper the cut, the closer you are to something real. But pain isn't proof. It's often just the smoke, not the fire. And yet, many belief systems rely on this confusion. They teach that hardship equals holiness. That struggle signals truth. That emotional agony is a sign you're getting closer to something meaningful. But what if that pain isn't proof of depth, just damage? Psychologically, we're wired to justify suffering. Cognitive dissonance makes us rationalize pain. It must mean something. It must be for something. Because the idea that we're suffering for nothing is unbearable. So we elevate the suffering. We say the pain is the path, that the weight is wisdom, that the burn is sacred. But sometimes, it's just a scar with a story you were forced to believe. And when you tell yourself the belief must be real because it hurts, that's when it tightens its grip. That's when you stop questioning, stop observing, stop healing. You protect the pain like it's a relic, sacred, untouchable, because to doubt it would be to admit the suffering was unnecessary. And that truth feels harder than the pain itself. This is how ideologies survive. They hurt you, then convince you the hurt is holy. They break you, then tell you the breaking is becoming. But truth doesn't always come with torment, and torment doesn't always come with truth. Some truths are quiet, gentle, liberating. So ask yourself, do you believe it because it's true or because it hurts enough to feel important? Because real truth doesn't need to wound you to be real. Imagine finding a map that led you out of darkness. Every turn felt perfect. Every sign spoke to you. It saved you. And then, without hesitation, you hand that map to someone else, believing it must save them too. But their path is not your path. What lit your sky might dim theirs. Your map might lead them into the storm you once barely survived. This is the illusion of universal meaning, the belief that your truth must be everyone's truth, that what healed you should heal all. But maps are personal. They're shaped by the terrain of your trauma, your history, your choices. Forcing someone else to follow it assumes their mountain looks like yours. Psychologically, this is called projection. We assume others feel what we feel, need what we needed, and believe what worked for us must work for them. But this erases individuality. It turns advice into pressure, love into manipulation, meaning into a weapon, wielded not out of cruelty, but out of unchecked certainty. Spirituality, philosophy, even therapy, none of it is one size fits all. What feels like awakening for one can feel like erasure for another. That's why some reject religion not from ignorance but from wisdom. Why some walk away not from fear but from clarity. Reality rebels when we impose blueprints onto beings meant to build their own. It fragments when we force alignment where none exists, breaking sacred paths meant to grow free. Your truth is valid, but it's not a law. It's a mirror, a story, a light you can offer, not a leash you should hold. So honor your path, but don't confuse it with the path, because some maps only work for one traveler, and forcing them breaks both the road and the soul walking it. Imagine scrolling through a feed that you think you control, until you realize it's been curated for you all along, not by code, but by culture, not by logic, but by timing, trauma, repetition. That's how belief works. You think you chose it, but more often, it was chosen for you, wrapped in the illusion of free will. Your beliefs feel personal. They feel like truth. But many are inherited, from the tension in your parents' voice, from the stories repeated in textbooks, from the silence after asking the wrong question, from being praised when you complied and punished when you didn't. These moments sink into your nervous system. They shape your definitions of right, wrong, safe, and sacred. And over time, they crystallize, not because they're true, but because they've never been challenged. Neuroscience shows the brain prefers coherence over accuracy. It wants stability more than it wants truth. So it favors the belief that keeps you accepted, even if it costs you authenticity. That's not weakness, that's survival. And so we absorb beliefs like algorithms absorb data, through pattern, through pressure, through repetition. Most beliefs aren't built, they're borrowed, picked up from the noise of childhood, society, media, and repeated until they feel like identity. And when you finally begin to question them, it feels like betrayal. But it's not betrayal, it's authorship. Here's the secret. Questioning isn't destruction, it's construction. It's how you take the pen back, how you begin writing your code instead of being written by it. So ask yourself, how many of your beliefs did you really choose? And how many were just cloaked algorithms, running in the dark while you mistook them for truth? Imagine being a child who asks, why? And is met with a frown instead of an answer. The warmth you crave pulls away, not because you've done wrong, but because you questioned. Slowly, your brain learns a dangerous lesson. Obedience equals love, and questioning equals risk. This is the obedience loop of love. You weren't taught love through freedom. You were taught love through compliance. The closer you stayed to the script, the more affection you received. Challenge the script, and the love grew cold. Not because you weren't loved, but because you were trained to believe rebellion equals rejection. Psychologically, this forms attachment conditioning. When love is offered only in exchange for agreement, your nervous system ties safety to submission. You learn to censor your thoughts, not out of truth, but out of fear of being cast out. And the older you get, the more this loop follows you. In relationships, at work, in spirituality, you confuse approval with connection. You perform loyalty, not authenticity. Neuroscience shows that rejection activates the same brain circuits as physical pain. So you flinch, not at cruelty, but at disapproval. You'd rather betray yourself than feel unloved. And so, the loop tightens. You stay silent. You stay small. You call it love, but it's fear in disguise. A love that demands your silence isn't love, it's control. Real love survives questions. It welcomes doubt. It doesn't punish rebellion. It honors the courage it takes to ask. The deepest bond isn't built through obedience. It's built through truth. Imagine being told to smile while your heart breaks, to call your pain an illusion, your grief a low vibration. That's the trap of spiritual bypassing. It wraps avoidance in the language of transcendence. It says, don't feel that, don't question that, don't express that. It's not high vibe. But real growth doesn't come from pretending you're past the storm. It comes from walking through it. Spiritual bypassing teaches that sadness is weakness, that anger is toxic, that doubt is a failure of trust. But these emotions aren't failures. They're invitations. Sadness asks you to slow down. Anger asks you to set boundaries. Doubt asks you to seek truth. When you skip them, you don't ascend. You split. You perform peace while chaos grows in the shadows. You smile on the outside while your inner world starves for honesty. Healing isn't light only. It's shadow, rupture, repair. Real spirituality holds space for pain without needing to fix it instantly. It listens. It stays. It doesn't shame the ache. It witnesses it. Because real growth is rooted in truth, not performance. And the truth is, you don't become whole by skipping the hard parts. You become whole by honoring them. The tears, the rage, the nights you questioned everything. They weren't detours. They were the path. You are not failing when you feel. You're healing. Don't let anyone tell you your humanity is a spiritual flaw. It's not. It's the doorway. The wound is not the opposite of awakening. Sometimes, it's the place where it begins. Imagine seeking spiritual truth and finding a business model instead, a ladder of ranks, a leader at the top, and a quiet pressure to climb. This is the Enlightenment pyramid scheme, a system where awakening is sold like a product and gurus operate like CEOs of truth. In this model, spiritual growth becomes transactional. You invest your time, money, loyalty, and in return, you're promised progress. Not inner stillness, but spiritual status. Not freedom, but access. The closer you get to the teacher, the higher your rank. And yet, no matter how far you climb, someone is always above you. This hierarchy mimics corporate culture. There's branding, packaging, gatekeeping, certifications. Followers are told that truth must be earned and paid for. That wisdom is something dispensed by those more advanced. But real enlightenment isn't a multi-level strategy. It's not distributed from the top down. It awakens from the inside out. Psychologically, it preys on spiritual insecurity. You start to believe you're not enough unless someone holier says you are. You tie your worth to approval, to rank, to rituals sold as sacred but designed for control. And slowly, your path turns into a performance. One where silence is mistaken for wisdom and submission for progress. The result? A loop. The promise of liberation becomes another form of dependence. You stop asking questions. You trade intuition for permission. You climb endlessly, not realizing the staircase leads nowhere, just higher tiers of illusion. And the irony? The more you chase status in these systems, the further you drift from the very stillness you were seeking. Because real truth doesn't need a middleman. It needs presence, honesty, solitude. So ask yourself, are you growing or just upgrading in a spiritual system built to keep you climbing? Imagine standing at a crossroads and hearing a voice whisper, "Go left." You feel it in your bones, tight, urgent, familiar. So you trust it. You follow it. But what if that voice wasn't your intuition, but your trauma? What if you're mistaking fear for wisdom? This is the confusion spiral, where survival instincts wear the mask of inner guidance. We call it trusting our gut, but sometimes that gut is wired by wounds, not wisdom. If your past taught you that chaos is normal, then peace will feel suspicious. If you learned that love means abandonment, then consistency will feel threatening. And yet, when those old patterns speak up, they feel real. They feel true. Neuroscience tells us the body stores trauma. The amygdala reacts faster than thought, flooding the nervous system with signals that once kept us safe. But what kept you alive isn't always what makes you whole, or what leads you forward into truth. Your instincts might be sharp, but sharp doesn't always mean right. So you stay, or you run. You ghost people who feel healthy and chase people who hurt you, believing it's fate or chemistry when it's just old pain dressed as love. You call the panic intuition, but it's just unhealed memory echoing through your body. Real intuition is calm, clear, quiet. It doesn't scream. It doesn't panic. It whispers beneath the noise, asking you to slow down, not react. But to hear it, you must untangle the trauma first. Learning the difference between intuition and injury is liberation. Not every strong feeling is truth. Sometimes it's memory, not guidance. Imagine standing at the edge of the universe holding a receipt, expecting peace, happiness, clarity. You prayed, you obeyed, you believed. Now where's your reward? That's the illusion of the cosmic customer, the subtle belief that the universe owes you comfort because you followed the script. You weren't promised a life without chaos, but you were trained to expect one. Many belief systems sell this lie gently. Be good, do right, think positively, and good things will come. Follow the code, and the cosmos will respond. So when suffering still arrives, it doesn't just hurt, it feels unfair, like a betrayal, like a broken deal. But the universe isn't a store. It doesn't issue refunds. It doesn't exchange belief for bliss. There's no celestial ledger balancing your suffering against your virtue. And yet, the expectation persists. You pray harder, surrender more, hoping the delivery will finally arrive, as if joy were a product you purchased through devotion. In psychology, this is tied to the control fallacy, the deep-rooted need to believe we can earn our way out of uncertainty, that if we think, act, or believe just right, we can outwit chaos. But life isn't a vending machine, it's a wilderness, and no ritual, however sacred, exempts you from its storms. Meaning doesn't come from what life owes you. It comes from how you show up, even when there's no payoff, even when no one sees, especially then. So ask yourself, are you living, or are you just waiting for the universe to pay a debt it never agreed to? Maybe joy was never a reward. Maybe it was a way of being that couldn't be earned, only practiced, only chosen, especially in the absence of guarantees. Imagine sitting in a locked room waiting for the door to swing open, waiting for the moment someone finally says, "You're allowed to leave." But that moment never comes, because systems don't grant freedom. They grant comfort, and comfort doesn't open doors. It reinforces them. You weren't meant to escape. You were meant to adapt. You're waiting for your belief system to give you permission to live freely. But systems rarely offer exits. They offer loops. They teach you that freedom is dangerous, that doubt is disloyal, and that questioning is rebellion. So you stay seated, hoping for a green light that was never meant to appear. Psychologically, this is known as learned containment. You internalize the rules until they don't need to be enforced from outside. They're policed from within. Your brain builds walls from teachings that were only meant to keep you in line, not help you grow. And over time, obedience becomes mistaken for virtue. Safety becomes your cage. Neuroscience shows that the brain prefers consistency over truth. It would rather be wrong with confidence than uncertain with possibility. You cling to what you've known, even if it shrinks you, even if it stifles your becoming. You tell yourself you're being loyal, But really, you're just afraid to walk without a map. You mistake the familiar ache for belonging. Freedom doesn't come with a stamp of approval. It comes with a leap. You won't be given permission to be free. You'll have to take it. You'll have to feel the fear of leaving the script and walk anyway. Real liberation isn't loud. It's quiet. It's personal. It's the moment you stop asking for someone else's blessing and start trusting your own. So ask yourself, are you still waiting for permission? Or are you finally ready to walk through the door that's always been unlocked? Imagine wearing a mask for so long that you forget it's not your face. That's what happens when truth becomes identity, when belief becomes branding. At first, the ideas are yours, but over time, you become theirs. You no longer ask what's true. You ask what fits the theme, what aligns with your image. Because now, you're not just someone who believes, you're someone who's built a self around the belief. And questioning it doesn't feel like growth, it feels like betrayal. The more visible your identity becomes, the more trapped you feel, especially if people applaud you for it, especially if they follow you for it. Because now, changing your mind isn't evolution, it's risk. And so you hold the same truth even when it stops holding you. You repeat it louder, you decorate it, you defend it, not because it's still right, but because it's still yours. That's when truth becomes costume, an outfit tailored to identity. You stop listening, you start performing, and the cost is clarity, because real truth doesn't serve ego, it shatters it. It invites contradiction, it evolves. But identity resists that. It wants consistency, predictability, applause, and so you become loyal to an old version of yourself, even when new evidence whispers, change. Growth demands disloyalty to who you were, and courage to become who you weren't allowed to be. The truth should change you. If it doesn't, it's just marketing. Let the mask drop. Let truth breathe. Live true. Imagine thinking you're humble, not because you are, but because someone told you so. Not from inner reflection, but from a system that taught you humility as a badge, a label, a silent signal of being above the ego. But here's the paradox. When humility becomes an identity, it stops being humility. It becomes performance. This is the humble superiority trap, where humility isn't practiced, it's claimed, worn like a cloak, and beneath it, quiet judgment. You don't think you're better, but you're proud of not thinking you're better, and that pride calcifies, becomes part of the structure, a soft echo that whispers, I'm more enlightened because I don't need to say I am. Systems, especially spiritual or moral ones, often reward this inversion. You're not praised for certainty, but for appearing detached from it. You're not applauded for status, but for denying it gracefully. And slowly, the performance becomes internalized. You stop just performing humility. You start believing you own it. And in doing so, you subtly elevate yourself above those who don't. Your lack of ego becomes your ego. Psychologically, this is moral licensing. The more you view yourself as virtuous, the more permission you feel to judge others who aren't. Not overtly, just enough to feel quietly superior. You've transcended competition, but still keep score, in silence. You don't brag, but you notice. And that noticing becomes your hidden hierarchy. True humility isn't a role. It doesn't advertise. It listens more than it speaks and doubts itself more than it proves. It questions itself constantly. It knows how dangerous virtue can be when it's never challenged. So ask yourself, are you humble, or have you just been trained to wear humility as a crown no one's allowed to see? Imagine walking through a calm forest, birds singing, light filtering through the trees, and yet your shoulders are tense, your breath shallow, your mind scanning for a threat. There's no danger, but your body doesn't believe it, because you weren't trained to see peace, you were trained to survive. This is the unseen threat lens, the internal filter shaped by trauma, anxiety, and constant hypervigilance. When you've lived too long expecting the worst, safety feels like a setup. Calm becomes unfamiliar. and unfamiliar feels unsafe, even when it's exactly what you need most. Neuroscience shows that chronic stress rewires the brain. The amygdala, the fear center, becomes overactive. The prefrontal cortex, the rational part, gets quieter. You're not overreacting. You're reacting exactly as you were trained to, by noise, neglect, or chaos. But that training no longer serves you. You might interpret kindness as manipulation, silence as judgment, stability as boredom or emotional distance. You push away peace because peace doesn't match your nervous system's programming, and then you wonder why life keeps feeling like a battlefield when the war ended years ago. We often mistake tension for truth. Just because your body feels alarmed doesn't mean something's wrong. It might just mean something's different. Healing starts when you question the alarm, not obey it blindly. When you pause and ask, is this fear, or is it the echo of old fear? Real safety doesn't always feel like a rush. Sometimes it feels boring, quiet, still, gentle, unremarkable. It doesn't demand your defenses, it allows them to rest. The goal isn't to never feel fear. The goal is to know when it's lying to you. Imagine someone offering you eternal peace, but only if you obey, only if you stop questioning, only if you surrender your doubts, your desires, your voice. That's not salvation, that's leverage, and it's the oldest form of control dressed as divine reward. When a system claims to hold the keys to your afterlife, it no longer needs to earn your trust in this one. It can demand anything: loyalty, silence, sacrifice. Because it's not appealing to your reason, it's hijacking your fear. The fear of being cast out, of being wrong forever. And when the stakes are infinite, even coercion starts to look like guidance. But what you call faith might just be fear with better marketing. Psychologically, this is spiritual blackmail, the manipulation of existential vulnerability. When someone convinces you that they alone can save your soul, they bypass logic. You stop questioning. You start obeying. Not from love, but from terror of eternal punishment. And here's the tragedy. You don't negotiate with someone who holds your eternity hostage. You comply. You conform. And in doing so, you lose more than freedom. You lose yourself. Your soul becomes currency traded in a market of fear. Real spirituality doesn't demand obedience through fear. It doesn't weaponize the unknown. It invites reflection. It welcomes doubt. It thrives in freedom. So ask yourself, did you choose your beliefs freely, or were you warned into them, frightened into silence, promised peace only if you played by rules you never got to write? Because whoever claims ownership of your salvation claims ownership of your soul. And some prisons are built not with chains, but with light, softly glowing, gently closed around you. Imagine looking into a mirror and flinching, not because the image is foreign, but because it's familiar in a way you wish it weren't. That's the dogma mirror effect. Sometimes, the belief you resist with the most force isn't your enemy, it's your reflection. We don't just fight dogmas we reject. We often fight the ones we once loved or still believe in, quietly, secretly, beneath layers of shame or disillusionment. And the harder we push them away, the more tightly they seem to hold on. Because you're not just arguing with an idea, you're arguing with a former version of yourself. Psychologically, this is known as identity fragmentation. When a part of us no longer fits who we think we are, we exile it. But it doesn't disappear. It lingers in the subconscious, waiting to be reconciled. So when you encounter that dogma again, in someone else's words, in a social post, in an old memory, it feels unbearable. Not because it's false, but because it's too familiar, too close to home. Neuroscience shows that the brain is wired to defend its self-concept. Anything that threatens your narrative triggers the same pain centers as physical harm. You feel exposed, so you lash out, you mock, you reject. But often, what you're really trying to destroy is the echo of who you used to be. The paradox is this: your fiercest rejection may be a buried form of grief, a plea for closure, a quiet hope that someone, maybe even you, will say, "It's okay to change. You don't have to hate the past to outgrow it. Real freedom doesn't come from destroying the mirror. It comes from looking into it and saying, I see you, I've changed, and it's okay. So ask yourself, is this resistance really about the dogma or about the part of you that once believed it? Imagine walking through your life thinking you're free, only to realize you're still arguing with a voice from your past. That's the ghost of belief. Even after you stop believing, something lingers. A whisper, a warning, a rule etched so deep into childhood that it echoes long after you outgrow the system. You question the dogma, you reject the doctrine, but still, you hesitate. You feel guilt. You flinch at joy. Not because you believe anymore, but because you once did. And belief, when planted early, doesn't leave quietly. It becomes a reflex, a shape in the dark, a should you can't trace. That's why healing isn't just about changing your mind. It's about unlearning your nervous system. The ghost doesn't haunt your logic. It haunts your reactions, your tone, your shame. It tells you not to speak too loud, not to feel too much, not to step too far. It disguises itself as humility, as caution, as obedience. And yet, it's still control, just without the preacher, the doctrine, the threat. You carry it like muscle memory, but ghosts don't own you. They linger because you haven't spoken back. You haven't turned and said, I see you. I remember why you were there, but I'm not that child anymore. And this life is mine now. Healing is not erasure, it's confrontation. It's reclaiming your voice from the shadows. You don't silence the ghost by denying it. You free yourself by facing it, by choosing presence over programming. The ghost is a memory. You are a reality, and only one of you is alive. So speak. Speak even if your voice shakes. Breathe even if your past trembles. Walk forward, knowing the ghost cannot follow where you awaken. Awaken. Imagine being praised not when you heal, but when you hurt. Not when you rise, but when you kneel. This is the hidden architecture of many belief systems, where guilt becomes a loyalty test. The more shame you carry, the more faithful you're seen, as if devotion were measured by how broken you can remain. Over time, guilt is no longer a signal of wrongdoing, it becomes a badge of honor. You're conditioned to see shame as a virtue, to feel wrong just for existing, to call it humility. But it's not humility, it's control. Because guilt is sticky. It keeps you in place. It keeps you obedient. And the deeper it sinks, the more devoted you look. It becomes your proof that you care, when in reality, it only proves you've been conditioned not to stop hurting. Systems, religious, cultural, even familial, reward this cycle. They don't have to punish you directly. They just teach you to punish yourself. You become your own warden, your own whip. You confess things that aren't sins. You apologize for your own existence. You shrink in the name of faith, calling it transformation. Psychologically, this is internalized control. The guilt isn't a sign you're evolving. It's a sign the system has succeeded. You've accepted suffering as sacred. You've confused punishment with purification. And the more pain you carry, the more noble you're told you are. And worst of all, you begin to fear who you'd be without the guilt. It becomes your compass, your identity, your proof of commitment. Without it, you feel hollow, ungrounded, disloyal. But guilt is not devotion. Shame is not transformation. And pain is not proof of truth. They are only tools. When left unchecked, they become chains. So ask yourself, do you feel guilty because you've failed, or because you've been trained to confuse self-erasure with loyalty? Imagine standing in front of a mirror that only reflects what you want to see. You smile, and it smiles back. But behind that glass, there's a shadow. Truths you won't touch, flaws you won't name. Why? Because you believe you're a good person. And that belief, while comforting, can quietly become a cage that locks you inside your own reflection. We all want to think of ourselves as moral, kind, fair. It's human. But when that self-image becomes sacred, we stop growing. We reject feedback, deny harm, reinterpret memories, and silence critics, all to protect that fragile reflection. The brain, wired for cognitive dissonance, defends identity at the cost of truth. Psychology shows we don't act from truth. We act to stay consistent with who we think we are. So if you've decided you're good, then anything you've done that causes harm must be reinterpreted, excused, or erased. Otherwise, the mirror cracks. This is how harm hides in plain sight. Good people cause damage. Good people lie, judge, exclude. Not because they're evil, but because they refuse to see themselves clearly. "I didn't mean to" becomes a shield. Intent replaces accountability, and growth dies in the comfort of self-righteousness. Real goodness isn't in the belief. It's in the courage to question that belief, to ask, what am I avoiding, ignoring, or distorting only to protect my image from uncomfortable truths? The goal isn't to stop being good, it's to stop needing to feel good to do what's right. Because the moment your goodness becomes armor, it also becomes blindness, a shield that keeps you from seeing the harm you never meant to cause. Imagine standing on a stage, repeating lines you didn't write, lines you were praised for saying. You don't believe them, not deeply, but you know how to deliver them. With the right tone, the right rhythm, the right nods from the crowd. That's not faith, that's theater. And in many systems, performance is confused with belief, rewarded, even worshipped. You learn early, speak the script, earn approval, question the script, face, exile. So you adapt, your faith becomes fluent in appearances, you say the right things in public, you quote the familiar phrases, you attend the rituals and wear the mask. And for that, you're praised, safe, protected. But behind your eyes, doubt, stillness, a quiet tension between what's said and what's truly sensed. This isn't hypocrisy, it's survival. In environments where questioning is punished and conformity is sacred, performance becomes a shield. You rehearse belief until the act becomes automatic, until even you forget it's a performance. But deep down, it's hollow. Faith lives on your lips, not in your bones. Psychologists call this cognitive dissonance, the friction between inner reality and outer role. The more you perform, the harder it becomes to tell where the role ends and you begin. You become fluent in appearances, but silent in truth. But real belief doesn't beg for applause. It isn't loud. It isn't staged. It's private, quiet, lived not in public rituals, but in private honesty. It's not what you post, but how you carry yourself when no one is watching. So ask yourself, do you believe, or do you just perform what's safest to be seen believing? Because applause fades. But the silence inside you never lies, and it's always waiting to be heard. Imagine walking into a room where everyone wears the same scar. They greet you not with curiosity, but with recognition, because pain is the password. In this room, suffering isn't just shared, it's sacred. And healing? That's betrayal. This is the Sacred Scar Club. Some belief systems aren't built around truth. They're built around trauma. They offer identity, belonging, even purpose, but only if you stay broken. You're not bonded by values. You're bonded by wounds. The deeper your pain, the more valid your place. But if you start to heal, to shift, to grow, you become a threat. A reminder that the pain wasn't permanent, that the cage wasn't locked, that maybe, just maybe, there's another way. Psychologically, this is trauma bonding, a connection built on shared suffering rather than mutual growth. These groups often feel like home because they reflect your old survival patterns. But comfort isn't always healthy. Some comfort is just familiarity with pain, and pain, when celebrated too long, becomes identity. Neuroscience shows that repeated emotional trauma wires the brain to expect, and even seek, emotional validation through distress. You learn that being hurt equals being seen. And in the Sacred Scar Club, your value is tied to how much you still bleed. Healing threatens the hierarchy. It says survival isn't the end of the story, that you're allowed more than just coping. The moment you stop identifying with the pain, you're cast out. You've changed. You forgot where you came from. No, healing didn't erase your story. It just stopped letting it define you. Real belonging doesn't require you to stay wounded. It doesn't fear your evolution. It honors your scars, but it doesn't ask you to keep them open. Imagine being told that forgiveness makes you holy, that no matter what happened, your job is to let it go, smile, and rise above. Sounds noble, right? But sometimes, that teaching isn't about healing, it's about control. In many belief systems, forgiveness isn't offered as freedom. It's demanded as duty. And if you don't forgive fast enough, fully enough, you're the problem. Not the harm, not the wound, but your pain becomes the burden. You're told that anger is poison, that grief is ego, that remembering is bitterness. But what if your pain isn't bitterness? What if it's truth? What if forgiveness too quickly becomes forgetting? Some teachings don't just invite peace, they enforce silence. They frame your boundaries as moral failure, your voice as vengeance. They say, if you were really spiritual, you wouldn't still be hurt. But healing doesn't happen on command. Forgiveness that's forced is just another way of swallowing your story so someone else stays comfortable. Real forgiveness isn't submission, it's choice. And choice requires power. The power to say, I'm not ready, or I may never be. That's not weakness, it's integrity. Forgiveness is not a spiritual shortcut. It's not proof of your enlightenment. Sometimes, the most sacred thing you can do is not forgive until your heart feels safe, your story is honored, and your voice is heard. Healing doesn't always end in reunion. Sometimes it ends in separation. And that's holy, too. You don't owe anyone your silence. You owe yourself the truth. Forgive if you want. Stay angry if you need. What matters is that the decision is yours. Not demanded, not forced, not spiritualized into surrender. You're free. Imagine standing still and calling it surrender. Not because you've found peace, but because you've convinced yourself that fate has a plan. This is the destiny worship model. The belief that everything is written and your job is to wait, not act. You don't create, you submit. And over time, you mistake stillness for spiritual maturity. The idea of destiny feels comforting. It removes the burden of uncertainty. If everything is meant to happen, then failure isn't your fault, and risk loses its sting. But there's a hidden cost. You stop engaging with life. You stop initiating. You defer choices to an invisible script you're not allowed to read. Your dreams become passive prayers, whispered instead of pursued. Psychologically, it's a coping mechanism. The brain wants patterns, it wants meaning. And when life feels chaotic, the idea of a pre-written path calms the storm. But that calm becomes passivity. You hesitate to speak, to move, to disrupt. Because what if the plan is divine? What if your desire is disobedience? What if stepping forward is seen as betrayal? Soon your waiting becomes worship, your silence becomes submission, and your potential dies in the name of patience. You call it trust, but it's fear, wrapped in faith's clothing. A fear that if you dare to move, you might interfere with the script. But what if there is no script? What if you are the author? This doesn't mean destiny isn't real. It means you're more than a passenger. Creation requires friction, movement, choice. And divinity, if it exists, might not want your silence. It might want your participation. It might want your mistakes, your voice, your risk. So ask yourself, do you believe in destiny because it guides you, or because it excuses your stillness? Maybe you weren't supposed to wait. Maybe you were supposed to begin. Imagine standing before a vast landscape of gray, mountains, rivers, valleys, and being told to choose, black or white. That's the world many belief systems offer, saved or damned, right or wrong, all or nothing. But your soul was never meant to live inside a checkbox, reduced to either-or judgments that erase your depth and humanity. This is the binary salvation trap, where complex inner worlds are flattened into simple categories. The moment you embrace nuance, you threaten the system. Why? Because systems don't thrive on truth. They thrive on clarity, obedience, and control. Psychologically, binary thinking feels safe. It gives your brain a shortcut. This is good, that is bad. It removes the burden of questioning, of sitting in the unknown. But the comfort comes at a cost. You begin to mistrust ambiguity. You silence doubt. You fear contradiction. And you learn to fear yourself, your shadows, your questions, your messiness. In these systems, redemption is transactional. Believe X, behave Y, avoid Z, and you're in. Fail the checklist, and you're out. But souls don't work like spreadsheets. People evolve. They contradict themselves. They grow in spirals, not straight lines. The danger is this. When you live inside a binary, you either condemn yourself forever for a single flaw, or worse, you blind yourself to your flaws because your label says good. True growth demands nuance. Healing requires paradox. You can be both hurt and hurting, both lost and searching, both kind and wrong, because contradiction is the soil of transformation. Freedom doesn't lie in picking the right box. It lies in realizing there were never boxes, just fear trying to make the world smaller. Imagine walking through life in a robe that doesn't fit, too big in the shoulders, unfamiliar in scent, soft but not yours. That's how most people live their beliefs. Not built, borrowed, not felt, inherited. You wear the system because it was handed to you, not because it was earned, tested, or chosen. You didn't build the walls around you. You were born inside them. Your faith, your politics, your worldview. Delivered like furniture in a furnished room, comfortable enough to keep, too familiar to question. So you decorate the space, memorize the rules, call it home. But deep down, you know it isn't. In psychology, this is called introjection, absorbing beliefs from others without evaluating them. You internalize the voice of authority and call it your own. You mistake inheritance for identity. You mistake agreement for alignment. You perform belief to feel safe, to belong. And when it doesn't fit, you shrink. You fold. You blame yourself instead of questioning the robe. But discomfort is a signal, not of failure, but of awakening. It's the body's quiet protest against a borrowed self. And still, you try to fit into something never made for you, a script you didn't write, a language that never felt honest. Beliefs aren't meant to be rented. They're meant to be forged. Through questioning, through rupture, through slow, honest construction. Real belief isn't handed down. It's carved out. It should feel like skin, not costume. So ask yourself, are you living by conviction or convenience? Do you recognize your own voice underneath the layers? Because a borrowed life may feel safe, but it will never feel real. And sooner or later, you'll have to step out of the robe and into yourself. Imagine being told that joy is the mountaintop and anger is the basement, that love is higher than grief, peace more evolved than pain. So you chase the better emotions and hide the rest in the cellar. But feelings aren't stairs. They're weather. They move, they shift, they pass through. All are sacred. All belong. This is the emotional hierarchy belief, the silent rulebook that says some emotions are enlightened, while others are evidence of failure. That to be joyful is to be whole, to be angry is to be unhealed, and to be grieving is to be stuck. But emotions weren't built to compete. They were built to communicate. Psychologically, this hierarchy builds shame into your emotional life. You don't just feel grief, you feel guilty for grieving. You're not just anxious, you feel broken for not being calm. So you suppress, you perform joy, you smile while crumbling, and you call it strength when it's really exile. Neuroscience shows that suppressing so-called negative emotions increases cortisol, disrupts immune responses, and damages emotional regulation. The body doesn't care whether your feelings are acceptable. It just needs them to be honest. Emotions are messengers. Ignoring them is like tearing up a letter before reading it. Grief means you've loved. Anger means you've been crossed. Fear means you want to protect. These aren't weaknesses, they're sacred signals. And if you don't honor them, they don't disappear, they amplify. Emotional maturity isn't about choosing joy over pain. It's about holding space for the entire spectrum, saying to every emotion, "You're welcome here," even the ones that make you tremble. So ask yourself, are you truly feeling your truth, or just climbing an emotional ladder that was never real? Imagine holding on to something that keeps hurting you but calling it holy. That's the confusion between devotion and dependency. Devotion is chosen. It expands you. It opens your spirit. But dependency wears devotion like a mask. It says, stay small, obey, don't question. And if you suffer, it's your fault for not believing enough. That's not reverence. That's fear. And fear can build temples too. Many belief systems blur this line. They say you're devoted when you're really just afraid to walk away. If leaving costs your worth or safety, it's not devotion. It tells you to surrender, even when it costs your soul. It frames your doubt as betrayal, your exhaustion as sin. True devotion doesn't punish you for asking questions. It welcomes them. It doesn't trap you in shame. It meets you in grace. But dependency needs you small, powerless, needing approval to breathe. It demands loyalty without love. And so you confuse endurance with faith. You confuse silence with peace. But your soul knows the difference. Devotion nourishes. Dependency depletes. Devotion calls you whole. Dependency drains you. If your belief makes you feel unworthy, unsafe, or unseen, it's not sacred. It's a cage. And cages can look like altars when you're told they're holy. Real devotion doesn't fear your freedom. It honors it. It celebrates your growth. You don't have to stay where love is only earned through obedience. Choose. Imagine growing up being told that shrinking is noble, that invisibility is strength, that the less space you take, the more moral you are. This is false humility programming, a quiet form of psychological conditioning that turns self-erasure into a virtue. You're not taught to be humble. You're taught to disappear and to feel proud of it. At first, it feels like wisdom. You speak less. You demand less. You call it peace. You confuse avoidance with grace. But what's really happening is internal erosion. You begin to view your needs as selfish, your opinions as prideful, your voice as dangerous. And so you dim day by day, convinced you're doing the right thing. Systems, spiritual, social, and cultural, reward this behavior. They call it holiness. They decorate your silence. They give you praise for bowing, not for standing. And in time, you start to believe the lie that disappearing is divine, that smallness is sacred, that becoming invisible is how you ascend. But this isn't humility. It's obedience wearing a halo, a ritual of erasure disguised as a virtue. Psychologically, it's a survival strategy. When your worth is measured by how little trouble you cause, shrinking becomes second nature. You begin to flinch from your own power, to apologize for being seen, to flinch from recognition. And eventually, you mistake this cage for character. You perform your disappearance so well, you forget there was ever a self outside the script. But real humility isn't absence. It's presence without arrogance. It's truth without domination. It makes room for others, but not at the cost of yourself. It allows voice without volume, strength without spectacle. So ask yourself, who benefits from your smallness? And did you really choose humility, or were you just trained to disappear in a way that made others more comfortable? Imagine a child raising their hand in a quiet room asking, "Why?" And instead of an answer, they're met with shame. Not because the question was ringing, but because questioning itself was forbidden, a sign of disobedience rather than a doorway to deeper understanding. That's how belief becomes control. When curiosity is treated like betrayal. This is what happens when questioning becomes sin. When systems label doubt as dangerous, they aren't safeguarding truth, they're safeguarding power, because truth can stand up to inquiry. But power built on control? That crumbles when you ask the wrong questions. Throughout history, regimes, religions, and ideologies have all feared the same thing, not rebellion, not rejection, but doubt. Doubt is the beginning of freedom. It loosens the roots of blind loyalty. It cracks open the walls of inherited belief, creating space for authenticity to grow where dogma once stood. That's why it's punished. Psychologically, this taps into our need for belonging. If asking questions leads to exile, humiliation, or spiritual condemnation, most people will choose silence. They'll trade truth for acceptance. And slowly, they'll forget they even had questions in the first place. But truth never fears inspection. It welcomes the light. It invites the test. Only lies demand silence. Only fragile doctrines need censorship to survive. If a system can't tolerate your questions, it's not because your doubts are dangerous. It's because the system is. So ask loudly, ask bravely, ask relentlessly, ask until the answers feel lived, not memorized. Because a truth that cannot survive your curiosity was never truth. It was a story told to keep you quiet. Imagine updating your entire life, new job, new city, new mindset, yet still running on the same beliefs you formed at age 10, like trying to run modern software on ancient code. That's belief update lag, and it's not just inconvenient, it quietly shapes everything. You've changed, your body has, your friends have, your fears, your future. But your beliefs, many remain untouched, still afraid of abandonment, still seeking approval from people you don't even speak to anymore, still obeying rules written by someone you no longer are. Why? Because beliefs are sticky. They're coded not just with logic, but emotion. Childhood pain, repeated messages, conditional love. You cling to them not because they work, but because they once kept you safe. They're like firewalls installed during a storm. Protective then, restrictive now. In psychology, this is called schema rigidity. Your brain creates a lens, a filter for reality, and then clings to it, even as reality evolves. You might upgrade your career, your relationships, your environment, but if the filter stays the same, your experience doesn't. You'll sabotage what you've built. You'll mistrust what you've earned. Because deep down, the old code whispers, you're not safe, you're not worthy. You think you're stuck, but maybe you're just running expired software, confusing survival instincts for truth. So ask yourself, what beliefs are you still running that were written in fear, not in freedom? Because if your external world has evolved, your internal architecture must evolve too. Otherwise, you're just living forward while thinking backward. Imagine being praised for staying loyal, while everything inside you whispers it's time to go. That's the loyalty bait trap. You're taught that loyalty is the highest virtue, that leaving is betrayal, that doubt is weakness. But sometimes, the truth you're serving never served you, and loyalty becomes a leash. The longer you stay, the more noble you're told you are. They say it's faith. They say it's honor. But what if it's just fear dressed in tradition? What if your loyalty is being used against you? They make you afraid to question, afraid to step out of line, because they've tied your worth to your obedience. But loyalty without truth is just submission, and submission without love is just quiet suffering. You were taught that sacrifice makes you good, that endurance makes you pure. But what if goodness isn't about how much you endure, but how clearly you see? Real integrity isn't staying forever, it's knowing when to walk away, not out of rebellion, but out of self-respect. There's a reason they call it loyalty. It sounds beautiful. But if it requires your silence, your shame, your suffering, it's not loyalty. It's manipulation. You can love something and still outgrow it. You can respect where you came from and still leave it behind. The most dangerous traps don't look like cages. They look like homes. And the strongest chains don't need locks. They just need praise. You don't owe your life to a story that keeps you small. You owe yourself the truth, even if it means letting go. Grow free. Imagine being told your way is the only way home. Anyone who strays from the map you were given is painted as lost, blind, or broken. You're taught to pity them, to fear for them, maybe even to condemn them, because that's how the tribe stays together. But what if the so-called outsiders aren't lost at all? What if they're just taking a different path home? This is the outsider condemnation bias, the reflex to judge or dismiss those whose beliefs don't match your own. It's not always born from hatred. Sometimes it's disguised as concern. I just want them to see the truth. But under that concern lives a deeper fear. The fear that your certainty is fragile, that your map is not the only one. Psychologically, this bias roots itself in group survival. Human brains are wired for us versus them thinking. Belonging feels safe. Dissent feels dangerous. The more we cling to our path, the more threatening other journeys seem. And so, we build walls, walls of pity, walls of superiority, walls of condemnation. Neuroscience shows that challenging our worldview activates the same brain circuits as physical threat. It feels like an attack. So we defend, we preach, we pity, but we rarely listen. And in protecting our own sense of being saved, we risk missing the richness of other people's stories. Real wisdom doesn't patrol boundaries, it welcomes questions. It understands that there are as many ways home as there are hearts to travel. The lost aren't always those who wander. Sometimes the most rigid path is the one that leads you away from yourself. So next time you judge an outsider, pause. Maybe they're not lost. Maybe they're just not on your map. Imagine repeating the same belief over and over, not because it's true, but because it's familiar, because it wraps around your fear like a warm blanket. This is the comfort loop echo, a psychological trap where we cling to beliefs that feel good, not because they reflect reality, but because they protect us from it. The human mind hates uncertainty, vastness, chaos, so it builds tiny shelters of belief, simple answers, easy frameworks. And then it repeats them, not to grow, but to stay safe. Like a mantra whispered in the dark, everything happens for a reason. Good things come to good people. It's all part of the plan. But deep down, something feels off, because these beliefs often aren't tested. They're rehearsed. They're rituals of reassurance, not revelations of truth. Cognitive science calls this the illusion of explanatory depth. We think we understand something deeply, but we've only memorized a surface-level comfort. When questioned, the structure collapses. So we avoid the questions. We stay inside the echo. Not because it's honest, but because it's bearable. Because outside that echo is the terrifying freedom of not knowing. And the danger? You stop seeking truth. You seek confirmation. You avoid the complexity of reality for the convenience of repetition. Truth becomes whatever doesn't disturb you. And soon, your belief isn't just an idea. It's a shield. A place to hide from the vast, unsettling nature of being alive. But growth begins at the edge of discomfort. At the cliff where your belief ends and the unknown begins. That's where the real questions live. That's where truth waits. Awkward, uncomfortable, and honest. Imagine being handed a box the day you were born, sealed, heavy, and unlabeled. You didn't pack it. You don't know what's inside, but you're told it's yours, and you must carry it forever. That's what systemic guilt feels like. Shame inherited, not earned. You carry guilt not from your actions, but from a belief system that made you inherit shame like family heirlooms. Guilt that says, you are flawed. Guilt that whispers, before you even speak, you're wrong. Many ideologies do this, not to heal, but to control. Shame is powerful social glue. It keeps people obedient, small, dependent. From childhood, you're taught which parts of yourself to hide: curiosity, sexuality, anger, doubt, self-worth, even joy. You're told these aren't sins of action, but sins of being. So even silence feels like rebellion. Even questions feel like threats. Even existing too freely feels like danger. Psychology calls this internalized guilt. The body holds it like a weight, even when the mind forgets why. You apologize for existing. You flinch at compliments. You feel responsible for other people's emotions, moods, even their disappointment. Why? Because guilt is now your baseline. This isn't conscience, it's programming. A system built to survive off your self-blame. And unless you question it, you'll pass it down again, just like it was passed to you. But guilt doesn't prove goodness. Healing does. And healing begins the moment you realize you can put the box down, not with permission, but with power. You can live a moral, meaningful life without being haunted by inherited shame or conditioned guilt. What you carry isn't who you are, and what you inherited, you can choose to release. Breathe. Imagine staring into what you think is the face of God, but slowly realizing you're staring into yourself, not your body, your essence, your longings, your fears, your grief, your craving for meaning. Maybe God isn't a being, maybe it's a mirror. And what you call divine is simply your most sacred projection, a reflection of the truths you carry but rarely dare to speak. Across time and culture, humans shape gods in their own image, fierce or gentle, wrathful or kind, distant or intimate. These gods don't just describe the universe, they reveal the soul of the worshipper. A punishing God often mirrors deep shame. A silent God echoes abandonment. A loving God may reflect hope or forgiveness withheld from the self. What you believe about the divine reflects what you believe you deserve. Psychologists call this projection, the mind's habit of casting the contents of the unconscious onto the world outside. You see judgment where you fear being judged. You see mercy where you ache for grace. The divine becomes a canvas painted with your inner world, one brushstroke at a time. This isn't blasphemy, it's introspection. It's why gods of war and fire ruled when survival was paramount. Why softer gods rose when loneliness outgrew tribal pride. Your idea of God evolves with your self-awareness, not because God changes, but because your mirror becomes clearer. So ask yourself, is your God angry, or are you still holding on to your own rage? Is your God silent, or have you fallen out of inner dialogue? Maybe the divine isn't up or out there. Maybe it's always been in the mirror, waiting for you to stop worshiping and start seeing.